Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable and science takes its time. Tonight we're going to the edge of an ancient lake in what is now northern Kenya, to a place called Nataruk, where the ground held on to a terrible memory for thousands of years. It is the kind of subject that asks for a quiet voice, because it deals with people who once woke to the same sun we know, walked along water, gathered food, carried children, spoke to one another, slept under the open sky, and then, at some point around 10,000 years ago, met a violent end that may preserve one of the earliest clear records of organised intergroup conflict among hunter-gatherers. That is a long phrase for a very human scene. A group of people lived near a green and productive lakeshore. Something happened. Bodies were left where they fell, some on the ancient edge of a lagoon, some partly in the sediments, and long after their names were gone, their bones remained to tell a story that is still being argued over by archaeologists today. The site, first reported in the last decade by researchers working in the Lake Turkana region, included the remains of at least 27 individuals, with 12 found relatively intact and many showing signs of trauma, including blunt force injuries, fractures, and in some cases projectile wounds. The team that described the site argued that Nataruk records a lethal attack on a small band of foragers around 9,500 to 10,500 years ago. That interpretation made headlines because it pushed the evidence for this sort of violence much farther back than many people expected, into a world before cities, before kingdoms, before walls and written treaties, and the many official ways humans have found to disagree with one another. Before we continue, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it in your part of the world right now? Maybe it is late. Maybe the house is quiet and the day has finally stopped asking things of you. Maybe it is earlier than that, and you're just looking for a slower way to think about the past for a while. There is something fitting, I think, in talking about an ancient moment of human violence while sitting safely in our own small moment of calm, separated by 10,000 years and yet connected by the same habits of mind. We still wonder what happened. We still try to reconstruct motives from traces. We still look at the evidence and ask the same difficult questions. Was this sudden panic or planned attack? Was it a fight over territory, food, water, kin, or simple bad luck at the wrong place and time? And what does it mean if people living as mobile foragers, without farms or permanent villages in the later agricultural sense, could still fall into the kind of collective violence we usually imagine belonging to much later societies? Nataruk matters because it is not just a pile of old bones. It sits right in the middle of a debate about what war is, how old it may be, and whether organised violence is something that appeared mainly when property and settlement became more fixed, or whether it runs much deeper in our species' history. The researchers who published the site argued for the latter, calling it unique evidence that warfare, or something very close to it, was already part of the human repertoire among some prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Other scholars pushed back and argued the interpretation was less certain than the headline suggested. That tension between evidence and interpretation is part of the story too, and it gives this old shoreline an unusual kind of life. If you find this soothing or interesting, or simply a gentler way to end the day, I would be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this quiet little corner reach more people who enjoy slow science, ancient history, and the kind of stories that reward patience. I always think these subjects do better when approached the way archaeologists approach a difficult site, not with rushing, not with grand certainty after 5 seconds, but with careful attention, one detail at a time, and a willingness to sit with what is uncomfortable. Because Nataruk is uncomfortable. It is not uncomfortable in the loud cinematic sense, with swelling music and dramatic reenactments of club blows at sunset. It is uncomfortable in a more serious way. These were real people. Some were adults, some were children. At least one woman was in the late stages of pregnancy. Several of the bodies seem to have been left unburied. Some individuals were found face down. Some showed injuries that suggest a close and brutal encounter. In the original study, the authors reported that 4 bodies were positioned in ways that may indicate bound hands, and one of the most striking details from the site was the recovery of fetal bones associated with the pregnant woman. None of that proves motive. None of it lets us hear voices or reconstruct the exact sequence with complete confidence. But it does pull these people out of the vague category of prehistoric remains and place them back among the living, where they belong. They were not symbols. They were not just data points in an argument about human nature. They were people whose final moments became legible only because a lakeshore changed, dried, buried them in sediment, and then waited a very long time. The landscape itself deserves a slower introduction, because it is easy to imagine northern Kenya only as a harsh scrubland if you know the region today from maps or photographs. But 10,000 years ago, the setting was different. According to the researchers, the Nataruk site would have lain on the margin of a lagoon near a much larger Lake Turkana, in an environment with marshes, woodland corridors, fresh water, fishing opportunities, and the sort of ecological richness that could draw people in and keep them returning. This matters because violence does not always bloom from pure scarcity. Sometimes it comes where there is something worth having. Good water, good fishing, access to game, safe places to camp, stored food, familiar routes, maybe even the social importance of controlling a favourable patch of ground. The Cambridge team noted the presence of pottery at the site, which raised the possibility that food could be stored there, and they suggested the attack may have involved the seizure of resources, territory, women, children, or provisions. That does not mean we can reduce the event to a shopping list of motives, but it reminds us that the old idea of peaceful foragers wandering endlessly through empty abundance has always been too neat. Real people move through real landscapes with preferences, rivalries, obligations, fears, and practical needs. A productive lakeshore is not simply scenery. It is opportunity. It is memory. It is a place one group might call home, or at least home for a season, while another group sees it as equally necessary. And when archaeologists describe Nataruk as evidence of a violent encounter between clashing groups, this greener ancient setting is one of the reasons their interpretation carries weight. The people there were not passing through a meaningless empty zone. They were standing in a place that would have mattered. What makes the subject especially gripping and a little unsettling is that it presses against one of the most familiar stories we tell about ourselves. There is an old comfort in imagining that organised human violence arrived late, after land became fenced, crops became valuable, and settlements became permanent enough to defend. Under that story, war is a kind of ugly side effect of civilization. One of the prices paid for storage jars, livestock, grain, and boundaries. Nataruk unsettled that comfort because the people there appear to have lived as foragers, and yet the injuries and body positions described by the excavation team looked, to them, less like scattered individual quarrels and more like the remains of an attack. Projectile tips were reported lodged in the skull and thorax of 2 men. Multiple skeletons showed severe cranial trauma. There were injuries to ribs, knees, hands, and necks. The bodies were not deliberately buried in a formal cemetery. In the view of the original authors, this was not simply one person meeting a bad end and then another. It was a group event, sudden and lethal enough to freeze a moment of collective violence in place. If that reading is correct, then warfare or something recognisably close to warfare did not wait politely for agriculture to invent it. It existed among people who still lived by fishing, foraging, and moving across a rich but demanding environment. That possibility is one reason the site drew global attention in 2016, not only from archaeologists, but from anyone interested in the long argument about whether humans are violent by deep inheritance, peaceful until pushed by social complexity, or, more realistically, capable of both cooperation and lethal conflict under the right conditions. At the same time, and this is important if we're going to do justice to the subject rather than just enjoy its dramatic headline, Nataruk is not a solved riddle with a brass plaque attached. Later in 2016, a group of researchers from Arizona State University and elsewhere published a challenge to the massacre interpretation. They argued that some of the supposed blunt force trauma might instead reflect damage caused after burial or through geological processes, and they questioned whether the site formation matched what one would expect from an unburied massacre scene. In simpler terms, they asked whether the bones had been made to tell a more dramatic story than the evidence could safely support. The original team responded and defended their interpretation, rejecting the alternative explanation for the lesions and insisting that intergroup conflict remained the best fit for the combined evidence. This back and forth matters for two reasons. First, it is how science works when the material is fragmentary and the stakes are large. Second, it makes the site more interesting, not less. There is a temptation to think debate weakens a discovery, but often it does the opposite. It shows us where the real pressure points are. At Nataruk, the pressure points are not trivial. They concern trauma identification, taphonomy, body position, burial or non-burial, the meaning of projectiles, and the danger of letting modern ideas about war settle too quickly onto deep prehistory. So as we move further into this story, I want to keep both things in view at once: the vivid force of the original interpretation and the caution demanded by the objections. That combination gives us a better lens. It allows us to be interested without being careless, and serious without pretending uncertainty is a flaw. There is also something else worth noticing before we get into the bones themselves, and it has to do with scale. War is a large word. It comes carrying armies, banners, marching boots, logistics, commands, memorials, maps with arrows on them, and official speeches by men who are usually standing in very pressed clothing. Nataruk has none of that. No written declaration, no fortification, no list of combatants, no polished account of who started it and why. What it has is more primitive and in some ways more powerful. Bodies, injuries, place, and context. That is why the site can feel so immediate despite the distance in time. Strip away uniforms and slogans and war becomes something much smaller and more brutal. A surprise at the water's edge, panic, blows at close range, a projectile striking soft tissue and bone. People trying to flee, shield themselves or protect others. Perhaps captives, perhaps children caught in something they did not understand, perhaps a raid, perhaps a clash that turned into slaughter. We do not know the exact sequence, but the archaeology gives us enough to imagine the human scale without inventing details we cannot support, and in a strange way, that restraint makes the scene more haunting. Later societies leave too many explanations. Prehistory leaves almost none. It gives you no speeches, only consequences. The old shoreline at Nataruk does not tell us what the attackers called themselves, or what grievance they carried. It does not tell us whether the victims had seen trouble building for days, or whether the attack arrived with the speed of weather. It only tells us that a group of people died violently in a place where life should have been practical and ordinary. That gap between ordinary life and sudden collective death is one of the reasons the site stays in the mind. What I find especially revealing is how quickly our own assumptions rush into that gap. Some people hear about Nataruk and immediately say, "Of course humans have always fought, how could it be otherwise?" Others react in the opposite way and say, "No, surely this must be an anomaly or a misunderstanding because true warfare belongs to later societies with leaders, stores of wealth, and land to defend." Both responses are understandable, and both can be too tidy. The archaeological record almost never rewards tidy answers. What it tends to reveal instead is a species with a very wide behavioural range. Humans cooperate on astonishing scales. Humans care for the injured, share food, make alliances, raise children together, bury the dead, tell stories and maintain traditions across generations. Humans also envy, fear, compete, retaliate, and organise violence when circumstances and incentives align badly enough. Nataruk does not settle the biggest philosophical questions about whether violence is natural or civilization is to blame. Sites do not carry that sort of final wisdom in their sediments. What they can do is narrow the field of honest argument. If the original reading of Nataruk is substantially right, then we have evidence that lethal intergroup violence among foragers in the early Holocene was not merely possible in the abstract, but happened in a way severe enough to leave a clustered scene of death. If the critics are partly right, then we learn something equally important about how hard it is to read behaviour from broken and ancient remains, and how tempting it is to let modern narratives harden around uncertain evidence. Either way, the site forces us to think more carefully about the old past and about ourselves, which is exactly what good archaeology is supposed to do. So tonight, as we begin, I do not want to rush straight to verdicts. I would rather start where the archaeologists had to start, with place, with bodies, with a lakeshore that was once green, and with the slow recognition that the dead at Nataruk were not arranged by ritual burial, in the usual sense, but preserved where violence or its aftermath left them. We are going to move carefully through the setting, the discoveries, the injuries, the interpretations, the arguments, and the larger question of what this site can and cannot say about the roots of war. We will stay close to the evidence. We will also stay close to the people, as much as the evidence allows, because it is easy for old bones to become a theory before they are allowed to remain human. The opening view, then, is simple. Imagine a rich lakeside world at the start of the Holocene. Imagine a small group of foragers living within it. Imagine a day that did not know it would be remembered. And imagine, much later, archaeologists kneeling in bright light over the sediments, tracing the outline of a skull, a hand, a rib, a stone point, realizing that the ground beneath them might hold not only one of the oldest scenes of violent death ever found among hunter-gatherers, but also one of the oldest arguments we still have with ourselves. The shoreline is quiet now, but it was not always quiet, and the story really begins when that older landscape comes into focus, and the modern dry country gives way in the mind to the greener and far more contested world those people once knew. To make sense of what happened at Nataruk, it helps to clear away the image most people carry of Lake Turkana today. The modern basin is dry, hot, windy, and demanding. It is the sort of place that makes outsiders think first of scarcity. But the people who lived around Nataruk roughly 10,000 years ago were not standing beside the same lake we see now, and they were not moving through the same landscape. During the African humid period, a long interval of wetter conditions across much of northern and eastern Africa, rainfall increased, lake levels rose, and places that are now harsh and resource-limited became much more favourable for human occupation. In the Turkana Basin, that change was dramatic. Researchers working on the region described the early Holocene as a time when Lake Turkana stood far above its present level, when shorelines lay well beyond the modern edge, and when the basin formed part of a much broader system of water, wetlands, and productive margins. The original Nataruk paper notes that the lake then extended about 30 kilometres beyond its current shore near the site, placing the dead not in today's dry margin, but on the edge of a lagoon in a much larger waterscape. That wetter setting was not a small local accident. It belonged to a continent-scale climate phase that scientists can trace in lake records, sediments, and shoreline deposits across Africa. The African humid period in the early Holocene is one of the best documented wet phases in the geologic record, and the shift was strong enough to transform some basins into enormous permanent lakes. Lake Turkana was one of those. Studies of shoreline deposits, drill cores, seismic records, and basin sediments indicate that during the wettest intervals the lake rose by as much as 90 to 100 metres above its modern level. At those high stands, Turkana was not merely fuller than today, it was large enough to overflow northwest into the White Nile drainage and to connect hydrologically with neighbouring basins such as Suguta and Chuba here. In practical terms, this means the people of Nataruk lived beside a freshwater system that was bigger, deeper, and more connected than the lake modern travellers know. It also means the local environment would have offered resources and movement corridors that make much more sense of repeated human use. That does not mean the shoreline was simple or stable, and this is where the story gets more interesting. A full lake sounds tidy, almost like a bathtub filled to the same mark every day. Turkana was nothing like that. The margins shifted, embayments formed and changed. Some areas flooded, then dried, then flooded again. One of the most useful studies for imagining the west side of the basin comes from Kabua Gorge, not far from several important archaeological localities in West Turkana. There, researchers reconstructed a dynamic lake margin made up of repeated inundations, black organic rich clays, silts, freshwater diatoms, paleosols and marsh deposits. Their conclusion was not simply that the area was wet, but that it was a shallow marshy embayment tied to the main body of a freshwater Lake Turkana, with the landscape changing over distances of only a few hundred metres. That is the kind of setting that creates a very particular human world. It gives you water, reeds, fish, birds, soft ground, shelter in patches, difficult footing in others, and a shoreline that is more like a living border than a neat line on a map. Once you picture that sort of margin, a lot of the archaeology around early Holocene Turkana starts to feel less surprising. High lake levels and relatively stable early Holocene conditions supported intensive foraging along the edges of the lake, and researchers describe the region at this time as one where aquatic-based subsistence flourished. People did not simply pass through for a drink and continue inland. They used the margins repeatedly and in focused ways. The archaeological record includes evidence of fishing camps along shoreline zones and technologies suited to riparian life. The Turkana Basin Institute notes that early Holocene inhabitants were likely riparian foragers, and several West Turkana sites have produced barbed bone points associated with fishing. The broader archaeological review of the basin makes a similar point from another angle, arguing that early Holocene fishing settlements occurred adjacent to high and relatively stable lake levels, and that these conditions encouraged localized, intensive use of the lake's productive margins. In other words, when the water rose, people did not ignore it. They built ways of living around it. The menu available in such a place was also much broader than the old stereotype of a few desperate foragers picking over a stingy desert. Archaeological and paleo-environmental work from the Turkana Basin shows that aquatic resources mattered greatly during the African humid period. Fish remains are abundant at some sites, and the evidence for fishing technology is direct rather than speculative. Researchers also note that fish were not the only useful creatures in these wet margins. Water birds, turtles, crocodiles, and even hippopotamus appear in the archaeofaunal picture for AHP communities in the region. The marshes themselves were resource zones, not just damp obstacles between dry land and open water. They offered access to reeds, shellfish or mollusks in some areas, birds, spawning fish, and freshwater inlets that would have drawn both people and animals. One reason the 2019 Paleo Environment Study called the setting a marsh-associated human landscape is that the sediments and microfossils point to precisely this kind of productive shallows. A marsh is not empty land waiting to become useful. To people who know how to work it, a marsh is a pantry with mosquitoes. The wider fauna help fill out the picture even more. The In Africa Project's field descriptions from ancient Turkana list thousands of animal fossils from early Holocene shorelines, including elephants, hippopotamuses, rhinos, giraffes, zebras, buffaloes, antelopes, gazelles, turtles, crocodiles, fish, lions, hyenas, and wild dogs. That list should not be taken as a promise that all of those animals were neatly lined up beside Nataruk waiting for the camera to pan over them. But it does tell us that the larger West Turkana environment was far richer than its present-day look suggests. It was a place where big herbivores and dangerous predators could thrive because there was enough water and plant biomass to support them. It was, as the project team rather sensibly put it, an amazing but also dangerous place to live. That combination matters. Abundance in ancient landscapes did not remove risk. It multiplied it. A green edge full of fish and game is attractive to people, and to crocodiles, and to lions, and very likely to other human groups who know a good shoreline when they see one. It is also worth slowing down on the word green, because it can be misleading in its own pleasant way. People hear Green Sahara or humid period, and sometimes imagine a lush and uniform paradise, as though East Africa turned into a giant garden with no rough edges. The science does not show that kind of calm abundance. What it shows is stronger monsoon rainfall, larger lakes, and landscapes that became much wetter than today, but still varied greatly from place to place, and often changed through time. At Turkana, some reconstructions emphasize sustained high stands in the early Holocene, while others show repeated oscillations and sharp shifts. One study found the lake peaking around 11.2 to 10.4 thousand years ago, and then dropping by more than 30 metres by about 10.2 thousand years ago. Another basin-wide review notes that after about 9,000 years ago, high-magnitude oscillations became more prominent. Even where the timing is debated, the shared point is clear enough. The lake margin was productive, but it was not fixed. People living there had to read water, shore, and season constantly. A camp that felt well placed one year might be exposed or stranded later. A good fishing zone might narrow, spread, or shift. The landscape gave generously, but it expected attention. That constant adjustment likely shaped how communities organised themselves. Researchers looking across the Holocene in the Turkana Basin argue that changes in water level correlated closely with settlement and subsistence. In the early Holocene, base camp-style occupations appear near the margins of a high lake, and later shifts in water level changed where people could live and what they could specialise in. This matters for Nataruk because the site does not belong to a random patch of dry country. It belongs to a shoreline world where mobility, skill, and knowledge of lake-edge conditions would have been central to survival. You would need to know where the water was freshest, where fish could be taken most efficiently, where game came to drink, where marsh ground became too unstable to cross, and which stretches of shore were worth revisiting. A rich lakeside environment encourages repeated use. Repeated use creates memory, and memory creates attachment. That is how a shoreline stops being just terrain and becomes a valued place. Even without fences or permanent stone houses, people can have preferred camps, habitual fishing grounds, trusted water sources and routes that feel like theirs. This is where the environment begins to touch the violence without reducing it to a single cause. The original Nataruk study and later paleoenvironmental work both suggest that resource-rich margins may have been worth protecting or contesting. That does not prove motive in the narrow courtroom sense, and it would be careless to pretend we can extract one simple explanation from wet sediment and broken bone. Still, there is a practical logic here that does not require modern cynicism to understand. Fresh water attracts people. Fishable lagoons attract people. Marshy embayments that combine freshwater access with plant resources and nearby game attract people even more. When such places are patchy rather than endless, and when several groups know their value, the risk of conflict rises. The 2019 West Turkana Paleoenvironment paper says this directly in cautious scientific language, noting that high stands created new opportunities for resource acquisition in marginal lacustrine environments, and that evidence of warfare may point to resource-rich localities worth risking bodily harm to protect. It is a sober point, but an important one. Scarcity is not the only path to violence. Sometimes people fight because a place is good. There is another reason the Green Turkana setting matters so much, and it has nothing to do with motives at all. Wet margins preserve. Dry surfaces erase. The original Nature paper emphasises that the Nataruk remains were preserved by the particular conditions of the lagoon, and that there is no evidence of deliberate burial. Some of the bodies seem to have fallen at the edge of the water, and the sediments of that environment helped hold the scene in place. So the same watery setting that made this area attractive to human groups also made it unusually capable of keeping a record after disaster struck. Archaeology is full of this kind of irony. A marshy edge can feed you, threaten you, slow your step, and then, if circumstances are grim enough, become the very thing that carries your bones into the future. If the attack at Nataruk had happened on a more exposed and drier surface, much of what we know might never have survived. The lake margin did not just shape life there, it also shaped memory, although not in any comforting way. When I think about the people at Nataruk in this setting, I do not picture them as abstract prehistoric humans, arranged neatly for a lecture slide. I picture the ordinary work required by a place like this: water containers that had to be filled, fish that had to be processed quickly before the heat spoiled them, children drawn toward the shallows and then sharply called back because crocodiles do not respect family routines, harpoon points checked and repaired, pottery carried with some care because replacing it is not fun even now, and I doubt it was more amusing 10,000 years ago. Camps set up where there was enough dryness to sleep and enough closeness to water to make the stay worthwhile. The In Africa project describes people in southwest Turkana at this time as hunters, gatherers and fishers, with evidence of butchery, fishing gear and pottery, probably used to store water, fish, berries or fat. That is not a life of random wandering. It is organised, skilled, local knowledge put to daily use. The Green Lake was generous, but only to people who knew how to work with it. And yet even a productive world has its tensions built into it. Marshes can isolate as easily as they connect. High grass and reeds can hide movement. Fluctuating water can trap groups in awkward positions or channel them into narrow approaches. Rich margins also concentrate activity. If everyone needs the same shore, the same water access, the same fish runs, or the same campable rise above the mud, then encounters become more likely. Some encounters are peaceful, some cautious, some transactional, and some disastrous. This is part of why the old argument about peaceful foragers living outside the logic of territorial conflict has never sat comfortably with the Turkana evidence. The basin reviews do not describe a timeless Eden. They describe changing ecology, specialised subsistence, and human adaptation to strong environmental shifts. In that kind of world, cooperation would have been essential, but so would vigilance. A green shoreline does not remove human competition. It gives it somewhere concrete to stand. So when we say that Lake Turkana was green and full of life, the full meaning is not just that the place looked better with more plants. It means the basin had become a freshwater-rich system with enlarged shorelines, marshy embayments, fishing grounds, dense animal life, and repeated human use during the African humid period. It means the world around Nataruk was productive enough to attract people and structured enough to make certain margins especially valuable. It means the scene of the later killings was not a wasteland but a lived-in edge where daily routines would have made sense right up until they stopped making sense. And it means that the environmental story is not a decorative backdrop behind the violence. It is part of the reason the site existed, part of the reason people were there, and part of the reason the evidence survived long enough for archaeologists to find it. Once that greener ancient shoreline is fixed in the mind, the next step becomes easier to understand because the bones at Nataruk did not appear in empty country. They surfaced from a place that had once been busy, wet, useful, and very much alive. The story at Nataruk did not begin with a grand unveiling or a clean trench cut revealing a single dramatic scene. It began the way many important archaeological discoveries begin, with fragments on the surface and with somebody paying attention. In 2012, during fieldwork in West Turkana, a new site was identified to the west of another locality called KL4. According to the project's field report, one of the Turkana field assistants, Pedro Ebea, had found the place during the previous year and showed it to the team on the first day of work. What made the location urgent was not only that human bone was already visible, but that some skeletons were partially exposed and modern activity in the area was putting them at further risk. This matters because archaeology often arrives after erosion has already started doing its own rough excavation, and erosion is not careful. At Nataruk, the remains were not tucked safely under deep sediment waiting politely for brushes and measuring tapes. They were already entering the open, where animals, weather and trampling could do more damage with every season. The field team noted that neighbouring homesteads had been established nearby, and that large herds of goats constantly crossed the area, breaking exposed bones and worsening the condition of the remains. So the first encounter with Nataruk was not the pleasant kind of discovery where a site sits untouched in a textbook state. It was the more stressful kind, where the dead are surfacing faster than they can be protected, and the archaeologists know immediately that delay will cost information they may never recover. The place itself was not especially theatrical in the obvious sense. The main site covered roughly 200 metres east to west, and 100 metres north to south, with low-lying hills, gullies and dunes shaping the surface. A dune ran along the south, another stood to the west, and shallow gullies drained away from the slightly raised ground. The field report describes a diffuse shell layer visible along the edges of those gullies, continuous with shells and carbonate deposits found below the surface. That geological detail may not sound especially gripping at first, but it is one of the reasons the site matters so much. It told the archaeologists that this dry, gravelly ground had once been tied to a very different environment, one linked to the late Pleistocene and early Holocene shorelines of a much larger Lake Turkana. Britannica summarises the setting in a similarly direct way, describing Nataruk as being found at the edge of a dry lagoon that had been connected to the lake during wetter periods. That older watery context helps explain both why people had been there in the first place and why their remains could survive in a recognisable pattern. By the time the team began serious work, they were looking not at an ordinary burial ground inland, but at an ancient lagoon margin that had dried, deflated, and begun revealing pieces of a catastrophe through its own slow erosion. What surfaced first was not a neat cemetery, it was a scatter. The project's 2012 report says the number of fragmentary human remains on the surface was one of the reasons excavation became a priority. In places, bone fragments had washed into gullies, especially to the north, after being exposed by erosion. The survey identified 27 human skeletons in total, but these were not all preserved in the same way. Some consisted only of scattered surface fragments, some survived as partial skeletons, and some were complete enough to excavate in articulation. That variety is important because it captures the odd half state of the site. When archaeologists first encountered it, Nataruk was neither fully buried nor fully destroyed. It was in transition. The bones were emerging from the ground, but not all at once and not all equally. Some still held together as people, in the rough anatomical order in which they had died. Others had already begun to dissolve into collections of elements that needed mapping, collection, and later sorting. If you imagine a burial ground with rows and markers, Nataruk will keep refusing that picture. The dead were distributed across the landscape in clusters and scatters, and the work required first of all a patient conversion of surface chaos back into spatial information. Before anyone could say very much about violence or war, they had to answer a more basic question. Which bones belonged where, and how much of the original scene still remained in place? That patient mapping matters more than people sometimes realise. The field team did not simply collect visible bones and move on. Their work focused on three tasks: mapping the site's extent and the distribution of fossil and archaeological remains, identifying all partially exposed human burials, and excavating those remains carefully. This might sound routine, but at a site like Nataruk it is the difference between history and confusion. When erosion has already exposed skeletons and washed fragments away, the precise position of every bone, every stone artifact, every shell layer, and every patch of sediment becomes crucial. The field report notes that eroded human remains form scatters of varying horizontal extent, and that the 12 articulated skeletons were excavated in full. That means the archaeologists were not simply lifting skeletons from the ground. They were trying to reconstruct what the ground had originally held, before gullies, goat hooves, and weather began rearranging it. In a way, the bones did not merely surface, They surfaced into an argument with the landscape. Every exposed piece had to be judged for whether it had moved, whether it belonged nearby, and whether it still preserved its original relationship to the rest of a body. That sort of work is slow and not especially glamorous, but it is what allows later interpretations to stand on something firmer than mood or imagination. The more disturbing the eventual story, the more care is needed at this early stage, and Nataruk demanded exactly that kind of discipline. One of the first major realizations was that Nataruk did not look like a normal habitation site. The field report says this quite plainly. Archaeological remains were rare across most of the site, and although there was one area with a greater concentration of lithics, mainly late Stone Age microliths, above the human skeletons on the ridge, the overall pattern did not suggest a substantial living surface. Faunal remains were relatively few, consisting mainly of broken hippopotamus and wild boar teeth with occasional bovids, and there were virtually no fish remains on the surface. By contrast, the majority of materials at the site were human. That imbalance is striking. At a shoreline locality in an area where early Holocene people used aquatic resources intensively, you might expect more obvious signs of ordinary camp life. Instead, what the archaeologists saw most clearly was the dead. The report therefore concluded that Nataruk was not a living site, or at most had once hosted only an ephemeral foraging camp. This is one of those understated archaeological observations that changes the emotional atmosphere completely. It suggests that the bones were not surfacing within the familiar debris of long domestic occupation. They were surfacing in a place where human remains dominated the story. Even before the trauma analysis, that concentration had to feel unusual. A shoreline can preserve camps, hearths, fish bones, broken tools, and the soft clutter of everyday use. Here, what emerged most insistently was a human event. As excavation continued, some of the bodies came into view in positions that were difficult to forget. The later reports emphasized that 12 skeletons were found in a relatively complete or articulated state, and that several had clearly not been buried in a formal sense. Cambridge's repository summary states that 10 of the 12 articulated skeletons showed evidence of having died violently at the edge of a lagoon, into which some of the bodies fell, and that the remains were preserved under the particular conditions of the lagoon, with no evidence of deliberate burial. Phys.org, carrying the University of Cambridge release, describes several bodies found face down, others in unusual positions, and some preserved in the lagoon sediments after the water later dried away. One adult male lay prone in shallow lagoon deposits, with severe injuries to the skull. A young woman was found reclining on her left elbow. Another woman, in the late stages of pregnancy, was found in an unusual seated position, first noticed because her broken knees were protruding from the ground. These are not the kinds of body positions that suggest calm funerary placement. They suggest interruption. They suggest collapse where the body came to rest, with water and sediment later doing what funerary ritual did not. Archaeology rarely lets us get close to a moment. More often, it gives us years layered together into an average. At Nataruk, a few of these articulated bodies narrow the gap. They do not recreate the final day in full, but they preserve enough disorder to make the violence feel immediate. There is also a very practical reason those articulated skeletons mattered so much. Once a body comes apart on the surface, its story becomes harder to read. The 2012 report notes that the bones were very fragile once exposed, and that many fragments had already been damaged or displaced. That means every articulated skeleton was a kind of rescue from further loss, a surviving packet of anatomical order in a site already under stress. It is easy to say 12 articulated skeletons and miss what that means on the ground. It means ribs still close enough to the spine to show body position. It means skulls close enough to the torso to reveal whether an individual fell face down or on one side. It means limbs bent in ways that can suggest restraint, collapse, or later distortion. It also means the archaeologists could relate injuries directly to bodies instead of trying to infer patterns from isolated bones gathered from gullies. The contrast between the articulated remains and the deflated scatters is one reason Nataruk became such a powerful site. It had enough disturbance to remind everyone how fragile archaeological evidence is, and enough preservation to allow unusually strong interpretation. The bones did not all surface in the same voice. Some whispered through fragments. Some still spoke in full sentences, and it was that uneven preservation, frustrating and fortunate at once, that made the site both difficult and extraordinary from the beginning. The dating work helped lock those surfaced remains into a specific time rather than leaving them as merely ancient. According to the Cambridge and Smithsonian accounts, the team used radiocarbon dating together with other techniques on the skeletons and on associated shells and sediments to place the event between about 9,500 and 10,500 years ago, around the beginning of the Holocene. That range matters because it places the site after the last ice age, during the wetter interval when the ancient shoreline environment still made this lagoon-edge setting attractive to foragers. It also matters because the age made the site immediately relevant to a much larger argument about the antiquity of organised violence. If the bodies had surfaced without secure dating, they might still have been a sad and interesting local mystery. With secure early Holocene dates, they became something else entirely. A candidate for one of the oldest clear records of lethal intergroup violence among hunter-gatherers. But that larger significance came later. On the ground, dating also did something more intimate. It located the dead in a real human horizon. These were not generic prehistoric people from an immeasurable abyss. They lived roughly 10,000 years ago beside a productive lakeshore in East Africa, at a time when this part of the basin was greener and busier than today. The bones surfaced from a place, but they also surfaced from a datable world. That combination is one reason the site feels less like legend and more like a recovered incident. Another revealing detail is that the first discoveries were made possible not just by chance exposure, but by local knowledge and collaborative field practice. The In Africa report does not frame Nataruk as a lone scholar's dramatic triumph. It records a team effort that included Turkana field assistants, National Museums of Kenya personnel, Cambridge researchers, and logistical support integrated with the Turkana Basin Institute and museum protocols. That is worth pausing over, because discoveries like this are often told in a strangely flattened way, as though important sites simply appear to institutions. Nataruk did not appear to an institution. It was noticed by a field assistant, flagged as important because of surface bones and exposed skeletons, and then rapidly made a priority because people on the ground understood what was at risk. The report even preserves the practical reasons for urgency: exposed remains, nearby settlement, goat trampling. That sort of detail is easy to overlook when later headlines focus only on the oldest massacre, but it belongs in the story. The bones surfaced because erosion uncovered them, but they entered science because someone local recognised them, someone else took them seriously, and a field team acted before the site degraded further. The ancient dead did not announce themselves in a museum voice. They relied on modern people noticing, caring, and doing slow work in difficult conditions. As more of the site was mapped, the picture became stranger rather than simpler. Of the 27 individuals recorded, not all were represented equally, and not all belonged to one neat cluster. Cambridge's release and the Smithsonian summary both note adults of both sexes, children, and individuals whose sex could not be determined because of preservation. The remains were distributed across the site rather than arranged as one orderly line of the dead. Some juvenile remains were commingled or close to adult women. No children were found with men in the pattern described by the Cambridge release. The image that emerges is not one of later ceremonial burial, where social relationships are carefully staged in death, but of a disrupted and uneven scene in which the dead came to rest in different ways and were later preserved with varying completeness. Even the way later articles describe the excavation reflects this discomfort. They speak of partial remains, exposed skeletons, and bodies left without burial, then preserved when lagoon sediments covered them. The ancient shore did not yield a composed funerary landscape, it yielded a broken human one. That is a different kind of archaeological encounter. A cemetery is sad, but it is organised sadness. Nataruk was more abrupt than that. Its surfaced bones carried the feeling of something unfinished, as though the place had been interrupted and then abandoned to water, silt, and time. There is too a visual quality to surfaced bone that changes how a site is read. A skeleton excavated from stable burial fill often emerges slowly, almost ceremonially, as the soil is removed. A skeleton already partly on the surface is different. It has been exposed by natural forces before archaeology arrives, and that exposure introduces both urgency and a sense of intrusion. The team at Nataruk was not the first to uncover these bodies in any meaningful sense. Wind, runoff, deflation, and gullies had already begun the process. Some bones lay in place, others had washed, others were breaking under goat hooves. The archaeologists were stepping into an event already underway, a race between preservation and loss. That probably helps explain why the project notes place so much emphasis on mapping and collection, not only excavation. When a site is actively surfacing, context leaks away. A rib out of place becomes harder to relate to an individual. A hand bone trampled into gravel loses much of its testimony. What makes Nataruk remarkable is that enough testimony remained, enough surfaced together. Enough could still be read as the edge of an ancient human disaster, rather than as a meaningless scatter of old bone. This is perhaps the quiet miracle of the site, if miracle is the right word for something so grim. The shore revealed just enough before destroying too much, and that is the point where the story begins to change shape. At first, there was a newly recognised site west of KL4, noticed because bones were visible and vulnerable. Then there was a mapped area with gullies, shell layers and low ridges. Then there were 27 individuals, 12 articulated skeletons, and bodies preserved in positions that did not look funerary. Then came the dating, the trauma analysis, and the much larger argument that would make Nataruk famous. But before all of that, there was this simpler and more affecting reality. The ancient shore had started giving people back. Not all at once, not intact, not kindly, but unmistakably. But a jaw here, a skull there, a torso still half in order, knees protruding from the earth, fragments washing north in gullies, human remains outweighing the ordinary debris of camp life. Archaeology often works by turning things into categories, and it has to. But on the ground, the sequence is usually more human than the categories. First you see bone, then you realise it is not one person, then you realise it is many. Then you understand that the place is holding not a burial ground in the normal sense, but an event. And once that realisation settles in, the scattered bones stop being only a discovery and start becoming the remains of 27 interrupted lives, each with its own body, age, position, injury and final place on that old lagoon margin. When the archaeologists counted the people of Nataruk, the number they reached was 27. That is the figure most often repeated because it is the simplest one. But even that apparently simple number carries a little archaeological untidiness inside it. In the field summary, the site is described as containing the remains of 27 people, made up of 6 young children, 1 teenager, and 20 adults. In the later published summary, the count is framed slightly differently as 21 adults and 6 juveniles, with the adults including 8 males, 8 females, and 5 individuals too fragmentary to sex confidently. Those are not competing versions of the site so much as 2 ways of organising the same difficult evidence. 1 adolescent can be counted separately in a field description, and within the 6 juveniles in a broader demographic summary. That is often how archaeology works. The dead do not arrive in neat columns. They arrive in fragments, ages estimated from bones and teeth, sexes inferred where possible, and categories that sharpen as the study improves. Still, the broad picture does not change. Nataruk held men, women, and children. It was not a gathering of only adult males. Not a battlefield in the later and more familiar sense, and not a burial place devoted to one narrow slice of a population. It was a cross-section of a small human group, or at least of the people caught in one disastrous event, and that is one reason the site has such force. 27 is not a statistic in the abstract. It is a camp-sized number. It is the sort of number that can contain an entire social world. That social world becomes more visible the closer you look at the ages and bodies involved. The juvenile remains were mostly very young. According to the published summaries, all but one of the children were under 6 years old. The exception was an adolescent of about 12 to 15 years, whose bones were notably small for that age. The younger children were not found in association with adult men, at least not in the pattern recorded by the excavation team. Instead, partial remains of 6 children were reported as commingled with or lying close to the remains of 4 adult women and 2 fragmentary adults of indeterminate sex. That distribution matters because it gently but firmly pushes against any picture of a purely male clash, a grim sporting contest between armed adults, while everybody else stood at a safe distance. The dead at Nataruk include the sort of people who make a group into a community rather than a fighting party. Small children, adult women, older adults, and at least one pregnant woman carrying a fetus 6 to 9 months old. Even if we remain cautious about the exact social relationships between these people, the demographic range tells us that whatever happened there reached well beyond able-bodied young men. It touched the dependent, the vulnerable, and the ordinary. That is part of what gives the site its emotional weight. It was not only violent, it was socially complete enough to feel domestic. The adult group was varied as well. The demographic profile circulated from the project identify young adults, middle-aged adults, and older adults among both men and women. There was no sign that this was a specially selected cohort, made up only of the strongest or most mobile. Some of the skeletons could not be sexed accurately because preservation was too poor, which is a useful reminder that archaeology is always working with partial clarity, but enough remained for the team to recognise a broad spread of ages and both sexes among the adults. If you pause on that point for a moment, the site starts to feel less like an isolated forensic puzzle and more like a disrupted camp or travelling group. Someone here was likely experienced and older. Someone was likely new to adulthood. Several were mothers or caretakers by age, if not by direct proof. One woman was near the end of pregnancy. Several small children were present. This is not the composition of a specialised war band in the later sense. It looks much more like a living group caught as a living group, carrying with it the ordinary structure of human company. And that may be why the published accounts sometimes use the cautious phrase, perhaps members of an extended family. The researchers do not claim to know the exact kin ties, but they do point out that the dead seem to represent a small band of foragers rather than a narrowly defined class of combatants. The way the bodies were preserved makes that impression stronger. 12 of the individuals were found articulated or relatively complete, meaning the bones were still in anatomical order rather than scattered beyond recognition. 7 of those were identified as men and 5 as women in the project's public summary, and several of them appear to have died where they were found rather than being formally buried. Some lay face down. Some were caught in unusual positions. Some appear to have fallen into the shallow lagoon margin and then been covered by sediment. This is the sense in which those lives were frozen in a final moment. Not frozen in literal ice, of course, but held by the lagoon environment in the posture of interruption rather than the posture of ceremony. Archaeologists are very familiar with deliberate burial. Bodies are placed, limbs are arranged, space is prepared. Nataruk did not primarily offer that kind of calm order. It offered bodies left as collapse and aftermath had arranged them, with the watery edge of the lagoon doing the preserving work later. That is why the site feels so immediate. Formal burial usually tells you what the survivors wanted the dead to become. Nataruk, at least in the project's interpretation, tells you something closer to how the dead were left when no one came back to set things right. A few individuals have entered the public record with more detail than the others, and not because they were more important in life, but because preservation happened to favour them. One adult male was found lying prone in lagoon sediments. According to the Cambridge-affiliated summaries, he had an obsidian bladelet embedded in the left parietal region of the skull, additional severe damage to the front right portion of the head and face, and blunt force injuries to the knees. The project team interpreted this as evidence that he had been struck more than once and had fallen face down into shallow water. Another man had major cranial injuries as well. A young woman was described as reclining on her left elbow, with fractures to the knees and perhaps to the foot, her hand position suggesting the possibility that her wrists had been bound. A heavily pregnant woman was found in an unusual seated posture, with her broken knees first visible protruding from the earth and fetal bones later recovered from within the abdominal area. None of these individuals can tell us their names, but their positions do something almost as important for the story. They stop the site from becoming one generalized mass. They remind us that 27 deaths did not happen to a faceless group all at once in a blur. They happened to separate bodies, each of which came to rest in its own way. The pregnant woman, understandably, has drawn the most attention in public retellings, and there is a risk in that because striking cases can overwhelm the quieter reality that every person at the site mattered equally. Still, her presence changes the scale of the event in a way that is hard to ignore. The project's summaries state that she was in the last stages of pregnancy and that the fetus was approximately 6 to 9 months old. Her body position was unusual enough that the excavators highlighted it, and the arrangement of her limbs suggested to them that her hands and feet may have been bound. Whether that interpretation will satisfy every critic is part of the later debate, but the basic facts remain powerful regardless. One of the dead was a woman near term, and the bones of the fetus were recovered with her. Violence in archaeology can sometimes feel distant because it is filtered through categories like lesion, trauma, and perimortem fracture. The pregnant woman brings the subject back to the scale of ordinary human dependence in a brutally direct way. Whoever she was not simply one more adult in a count. She was carrying another life inside her at the time of death. That single fact makes the site harder to flatten into theory. What also stands out is how little separation there seems to have been between the living arrangement of the group and the distribution of the dead. The children near women, the lack of children with men, the mix of young and older adults, and the presence of pregnancy all suggest people caught in a moment of daily life, rather than in a staged confrontation between neatly assembled opposing lines. That does not mean we know what they were doing in the minutes before the attack or clash. We do not know whether they had just arrived, whether they were camped for several days, whether some were processing fish while others rested, or whether the first signs of danger came from a distance or from very close range. Archaeology cannot usually deliver that level of narrative detail honestly. But the arrangement of ages and sexes does allow one reasonable conclusion. The group was not composed only of fighters. It included those who usually travel, sleep and eat within the ordinary social unit of a small foraging band. That is why so many accounts of Nataruk use terms like small band of foragers rather than anything more militarized. The site does not show an army. It shows a human party broad enough to include care, reproduction, age difference, and probably kinship. There is a temptation, when faced with remains like these, to imagine that the 27 all belonged to one tightly bonded family travelling together. Maybe they did. Maybe some were close kin, and others were recent companions or affiliates from neighbouring groups. The evidence at present does not let us say more than that the population profile is consistent with a small foraging community rather than with a specialised set of combatants. This uncertainty is worth holding on to because it keeps the account honest. At the same time, even without name relationships, the demographic mix tells us plenty. There would have been dependencies among these people. Some adults would have been responsible for children. Someone would have been slowed by pregnancy. Some older individuals may have carried knowledge more than physical speed. Some children may have needed to be carried or closely watched around water, Every one of those ordinary social facts matters when thinking about sudden violence. A mixed group cannot respond to danger the way a mobile party of unencumbered adults can. Children and the pregnant do not simply turn into background when trouble starts. They change the group's options immediately. That is part of why the Nataruk scene feels so bleak. The composition of the dead implies limited room for a clean escape. The group also seems to have been preserved at a threshold, both socially and physically. Physically, they lay at the edge of a lagoon, some apparently in the shallows, some on drier ground, some left where they fell. Socially, they sit at the threshold between individual biography and collective event. Archaeologists can estimate age, sex, and injury, but they cannot recover personal names, voices, or the exact social ranking of each person. So what remains is a strange middle zone. We know enough to see them as a real set of lives, but not enough to narrate each one separately. That can be frustrating, yet it also protects the site from false intimacy. It prevents us from pretending to know more than the evidence allows. 27 lives were cut short there. Some can be described in more detail because their skeletons were more complete. Others survive only as fragmentary adults of unknown sex or as partial juvenile remains. That unevenness is not a flaw in the story. It is part of the reality. Death scenes, like excavation, are rarely equitable. Some people leave clearer traces than others through no merit of their own. It is also useful to notice what the demographic spread does to the old debate about war and prehistory. If this had been only a cluster of injured adult males, many people would have felt more comfortable classifying it as a raid gone wrong between hunting parties, or a localized dispute that turned ugly. But the presence of women, small children, and a pregnant woman complicates that easy reading. It suggests either an attack on a whole group, or a situation in which a whole group was overtaken by violence. The original team leaned strongly toward the former interpretation, seeing the site as evidence of an intentional killing of a small band of foragers with no deliberate burial. Critics have challenged parts of that interpretation, especially around the reading of trauma and the formation of the site, but even those later disputes do not erase the underlying demographic point. The people represented at Nataruk were broad enough in age and sex to indicate community-level involvement in the event, whatever exact label we apply to it. That is one reason the site became so important in arguments about the antiquity of warfare. It did not merely show violence, it appeared to show violence reaching the full social body of a foraging group. I think that is what stays with people once the numbers settle in. 27 is manageable enough to imagine and large enough to be devastating. You can picture the camp scale of it. A handful of adults talking near the water, several children close by, someone heavily pregnant moving more slowly than the rest, someone older watching, someone young enough to still be half child and half adult. Then, all at once, or in a very short span, the group becomes not a set of living relationships, but a distribution of bodies that archaeologists will one day map on paper. That is what the old shoreline held on to. Not simply proof of injury, not only evidence useful for a debate about whether war predates farming, but a small society interrupted so abruptly that parts of it remained in the attitudes of the last movement. Once that is clear, the next thing the site asks of us is even more exacting, because after counting the people and seeing who they were, attention shifts to the marks left on them and to the difficult work of reading violence in bone without reading too much. What made Nataruk impossible to ignore was not simply the number of dead, but the pattern of injuries carried by the better preserved skeletons. 10 of the 12 articulated individuals were described by the original research team as bearing clear signs of violent death. The lesions were concentrated in places that bioarchaeologists pay close attention to when they're trying to distinguish accident from assault: the head, the neck, the ribs, the hands, and the knees. 2 individuals had projectiles in direct association with their bodies, one with an obsidian bladelet still embedded in the skull, and another with microliths found inside the thoracic or pelvic cavity, all showing impact scars. Across the in-situ skeletons, the published summary lists 5 cases of sharp force trauma to the head or neck. 5 cases of blunt force trauma to the head, 2 cases of possible depressed fractures to the knees, 2 cases of multiple fractures to the right hand, and 1 case of fractured ribs. The project's own public summary presents the same pattern in slightly more accessible language, describing head, neck, rib, hand and knee injuries as the main signature of the event. In other words, the bones did not show random damage spread evenly through the body. They showed a distribution that looked, to the excavators, like people being struck, shot and overwhelmed. That concentration on the skulls matters a great deal. In forensic and archaeological trauma analysis, the head is not just another bone cluster. It is one of the most common targets in lethal interpersonal violence, because a forceful blow there is efficient, disabling, and often fatal. The Nataruk team emphasised that most of the severe lesions involved the crania and faces. Their Cambridge summary spoke of extreme blunt force trauma to crania and cheekbones, while the Nature paper specified localised compression, depressed adhering fragments, radiating fracture lines, and other traits they considered consistent with perimortem injury rather than breakage long after burial. In the methods section, they explain that they use standard criteria for identifying perimortem fractures, including sharp or splintered edges, internal beveling, flaking on inner fracture surfaces, lack of colour difference between the broken edge and surrounding bone, and fracture geometry consistent with impact, while the bone still retained its fresh elastic properties. That sounds technical, but the basic idea is very simple. Dry bone and fresh bone tend to break differently. The researchers argued that the Nataruk skulls looked like they had been struck when the victims were still alive or recently dead, not crushed by weathering long afterward. The projectiles are some of the strongest parts of the case because they are harder to explain away than a cracked skull on its own. One adult male had an obsidian bladelet embedded in the left parietal region of the skull, with an additional perforating lesion on the right parietal and possible depressed fractures to the knees. Another adult male had projectile microliths inside the body cavity, one in the thoracic region and others lower in the body, again with impact scars. The original paper states plainly that the presence of projectile points embedded in bone or within the body cavity is considered diagnostic evidence in the study of violent conflict. It also noted that obsidian is relatively rare in other early Holocene later Stone Age sites in southwest Turkana, which led the authors to suggest that the people who attacked the group at Nataruk may have come from a different home range. That last point is an inference rather than a certainty, but the embedded and internal lithics themselves are not subtle. They are the sort of material evidence that cuts through a lot of speculation. A body can acquire many kinds of damage after death. It is much harder for a dead person to acquire a microlith lodged in the skull or inside the chest by accident. The neck injuries are equally revealing, even if they are less visually famous than the obsidian in the skull. The original case table lists perforating lesions on vertebrae for at least 2 individuals, 1 male and 1 female, and the broader summaries describe 2 cases of sharp force trauma to the neck. Vertebrae do not fracture in quite the same storytelling way as a skull, so these wounds get less public attention, but they matter because they indicate close-range force directed at a particularly vulnerable part of the body. The Cambridge release even illustrated 1 male skeleton as having skull and neck vertebrae lesions consistent with wounds from clubs and arrows. When injuries cluster around the head and neck, it strengthens the impression of deliberate killing rather than rough environmental damage or a generalised collapse of a body after death. Bones can crack under pressure from sediment or trampling, but vertebral perforations and sharp force lesions aligned with plausible weapon trajectories are much harder to place in that category. At Nataruk, the head and neck together form a repeated pattern, and repetition is one of the things that gives archaeological trauma interpretation its force. One strange lesion can be an anomaly. Several similar injuries across several bodies start to look like behaviour. The hand injuries are smaller in scale, but in some ways they are among the most human details at the site. 2 individuals had multiple fractures to the right hand, and one published description notes that the fracture on the palmar side of a woman's right hand may have occurred while parrying a blow or breaking a fall. That cautious wording is important because archaeologists are not mind readers, and a broken hand cannot testify in its own voice. Even so, hand fractures in contexts like this are often treated seriously because they may reflect defensive movement. A raised hand is the sort of ordinary last reaction that does not belong to heroic reconstructions or cinematic battle scenes. It belongs to panic. It belongs to someone trying, perhaps instinctively, to shield the face or head. At Nataruk, the combination of head trauma and hand fractures is one of the reasons the site feels less like a generalised death assemblage and more like a scene of attack. The bones do not only show that force was applied, in a few cases they hint at how the victims may have moved in response. That does not let us watch the event, it simply narrows the space between biology and action by a small but meaningful amount. The knee and rib injuries add another layer because they are harder to fold into a tidy single weapon narrative. The original paper records 2 cases of possible ante-mortem depressed bilateral fractures to the knees and 1 case of fractured ribs, while the project's public summary describes blunt force trauma to knees and ribs among the better preserved bodies. 1 adult male with projectiles to the skull also had possible knee fractures. 1 adult woman had consecutive rib fractures, possible knee depressed fractures, and an unnatural position of the left foot. These are not the kinds of marks that turn a site into a simple arrow ambush story. They suggest repeated blows, close-range assault, collapse, or a mix of weapons and body positions. The researchers therefore argued that at least 3 weapon types were likely involved: projectiles, club-like blunt weapons, and another close-range weapon capable of producing deep cuts, perhaps a club or wooden handle fitted with sharp stone blades. Whether every reader will accept that exact reconstruction is another question, but the broad point is sound. The wounds were varied. This was not one neat ballistic signature repeated over and over. It looked more like a violent encounter in which distance weapons and close contact force were both used. Then, there are the bodies with little visible trauma but positions that raised other suspicions. 2 of the articulated individuals showed no obvious perimortem lesions in the preserved bones, yet the original team noted that the position of their hands suggested they may have been bound at the time of death. The project summaries expanded that to 4 individuals whose hand positions probably indicated binding, including the pregnant woman. Here the evidence becomes more interpretive. An embedded projectile is one kind of proof. A hand position that suggests tied wrists is another. The first is material in a straightforward way. The second depends more on anatomical arrangement, and on whether post-depositional processes could have produced something similar. Even the original researchers signalled caution by using phrasing like bound in their case table and may have been bound in public summaries. That caution is worth preserving, because it shows the difference between what bone states clearly and what it only strongly suggests. Still, the possibility matters. If even some of those individuals were restrained, the event moves further away from a sudden equal fight and closer to coercion, capture, or execution-like handling of victims after the initial attack. The bones do not force that conclusion, but they open the door to it. One of the sobering things about skeletal trauma is that it is always an undercount of violence, not a full account of it. Bone records only what reaches bone. A blow that causes soft tissue injury without fracturing the skeleton can disappear almost completely from the archaeological record. Strangulation, stabbing into muscle, blunt trauma to organs, and many other fatal injuries can leave no lasting mark on the recovered remains at all. Even projectile injuries can be missed if they pass through soft tissue and do not strike bone, or if the relevant bones are not preserved. The Nataruk team explicitly worked from standard osteological criteria, but those criteria can only be applied where bone survives and where lesions are visible. So when the site is described as showing 10 articulated skeletons with violent trauma, that should not be read as a full body count of all injuries suffered by those people. It is the minimum hard tissue record that survived. This matters because readers sometimes imagine the wounds written in bone as a complete script. They are not. They are more like surviving lines from a damaged manuscript. Enough remains to understand the genre, but not enough to reconstruct every page. That is also why the debate about Nataruk became so intense so quickly. Later in 2016, a group of scholars led by Christopher Stojanovsky challenged the massacre interpretation in Nature, arguing that the case rested on three major inferences: that the burials were contemporaneous, that the bodies were left unburied, and that most of the cranial damage represented blunt force trauma from interpersonal violence. Their critique stated that the data suggested the burials might not all be contemporaneous, and that much of the cranial damage was inconsistent with blunt force trauma, raising the possibility that post-depositional processes had played a larger role than the original authors allowed. Arizona State's summary of that challenge put the disagreement very plainly for a general audience. Perhaps they argued there was no massacre at all. This is not a small footnote. It goes directly to the central question of whether the wounds in bone are really a coherent signature of a single violent episode, or a mixture of injuries, environmental damage and site formation processes that later looked more coordinated than they were. The original team did not retreat from its interpretation. In the paper itself, Mirazon-La and colleagues argued that the cranial compression was localized and could not be explained by taphonomic forces because unaffected parts of the same crania retained their original size and shape around the fractured areas. They also pointed back to the embedded and internal projectiles, the patterning of lesions on the head, neck, ribs and hands, and the lack of evidence for deliberate burial in the articulated bodies preserved by lagoon conditions. A formal reply to the critique was published in Nature later that year, and the project's public materials continue to present the site as one of the clearest prehistoric cases of lethal intergroup violence among hunter-gatherers. That does not mean the debate is over in some final and tidy sense. It means that the wound pattern remains persuasive to the original excavators because it is cumulative. No single lesion carries the whole case. The case rests on multiple lesion types, multiple bodies, weapon traces, anatomical positions, and the environmental context of preservation all taken together, and that cumulative quality is really the heart of it. If you isolate one broken skull, one damaged vertebra, one fractured hand, or one odd body position, reasonable people can disagree about what they are seeing. Archaeology encourages that caution, and rightly so. But when you place those features together across a cluster of individuals from the same site, dated to roughly the same early Holocene horizon, and add an obsidian bladelet still in a skull, plus microliths inside another body cavity, the overall picture becomes much harder to dismiss as noise. It may still be debated at the margins. Specific lesions may remain open to reinterpretation, yet the broad signal is why Nataruk has continued to matter in discussions of prehistoric violence. The site does not depend on a dramatic phrase like massacre to have significance. Even under more restrained wording, the bones preserve repeated evidence of severe interpersonal injury inflicted by more than one kind of weapon on a mixed group of men, women and children at an ancient lakeshore. That is enough to make the site consequential even before anyone chooses the larger label. There is something else the wounds reveal, and it is easy to miss because the technical language is so clinical. Lesion, fracture, beveled margin, perforation, depressed fragment. These are useful words, but they are also excellent at smoothing over what they describe. A perforating lesion on a cervical vertebra is a wound to the neck. A depressed fracture of the frontal bone is a crushing blow to the head. A fractured hand may be someone trying to fend off that blow. A rib fracture may be a strike delivered after the victim was already down or turning away. This translation back into ordinary human terms matters because Nataruk is not ultimately interesting for its pathology. It is interesting because bone preserves the physical aftermath of force in a way that strips argument down to essentials. Someone hit these people. Someone shot them. Someone came close enough to break faces, hands, knees and ribs. The bones do not preserve speeches, motives or banners. They preserve impact. And that is why they are so powerful and so limited at the same time. They can tell us that violence happened with unusual force and concentration. They cannot, on their own, tell us why the attackers came, how long the encounter lasted, or what those 27 people thought when it began. That next step belongs not just to trauma analysis, but to reconstruction, context, and the harder question of how a fertile lakeshore turned into a killing ground in the first place. Once the injuries are laid out, the next question comes almost automatically. What actually happened there? Not in the dramatic sense, not as a film scene with invented dialogue and a convenient camera angle, but in the narrower archaeological sense. What sequence of events best fits the bodies, the wounds, the positions, and the place where they were found? Nataruk allows a reconstruction, but only a careful one. The site does not tell us the season, the exact hour, or the words anyone spoke. It does not even give us certainty on every single lesion, which is one reason the later scholarly dispute mattered so much. What it does give us is a constrained field of possibilities. The articulated bodies were found at the edge of an ancient lagoon beside a much larger Lake Turkana, in a setting that around 10,000 years ago was productive, marshy, and attractive to foragers. 10 of the 12 articulated skeletons were interpreted by the excavators as having died violently there, with no sign of formal burial afterward. That combination already narrows the story considerably. However the day began, it seems to have ended quickly enough, and badly enough, that bodies were left where they fell, and only later preserved by lagoon sediments. The safest place to begin is not with the attackers, but with the people who were attacked. The dead include adult men, adult women, at least one adolescent, several very young children, and a woman in the late stages of pregnancy. That demographic spread strongly suggests a small living group rather than a specialised fighting party. In ordinary human terms, this looks much more like a band at or near camp than like a force assembled purely for combat. The original research team explicitly described the remains as those of a group of hunter-gatherers living by a fertile lakeshore, and raised the possibility that they represented a small band of foragers, perhaps members of an extended family. The broader environmental work on the area also supports that reading, since the lagoon edge would have offered water, fish, marsh resources, and nearby access to animals in a rich lakeside landscape. So when we imagine the day, the most grounded starting point is a mixed group at a useful shoreline location, likely engaged in ordinary subsistence life rather than marching in battle formation. That point matters because it changes the logic of the event. A group with small children and a heavily pregnant woman does not respond to danger the way a compact group of armed adult males might. It is slower, more exposed, and less able to scatter cleanly. Someone has to watch the children. Someone is carrying, helping, or staying close to the pregnant woman. Someone may be preparing food, dealing with water containers, or handling gear. Even without inventing any specific domestic scene, the demographic profile alone suggests vulnerability. If violence arrived suddenly, the group would not have had the luxury of transforming into an efficient defensive unit. That is one reason the original interpretation of Nataruk as a surprise attack or raid has always had a practical plausibility to it. The victims do not look like people who met another group in an arranged contest between matched combatants. They look like people whose ordinary social composition limited their options once force was applied. From there, the wounds suggest that the violence likely began, or at least included an early phase at some distance. 2 individuals had projectile evidence directly associated with the bodies. One adult male with an obsidian bladelet embedded in the skull, and another adult male with microliths in the body cavity showing impact scars. The Cambridge release describes the first man as having been hit in the head by at least 2 projectiles before ending face down in shallow lagoon water. Projectiles matter because they imply an attack that did not begin only with wrestling distance or accidental brawling. Someone launched weapons into bodies. Whether those were arrows, spears, or other shafted projectiles is still described somewhat cautiously in public summaries, but the underlying point is firm enough. At least part of the assault involved people striking from beyond arm's reach. That makes surprise more likely, especially against a mixed group at a shoreline setting, where some may have been stationary or occupied. Still, the event cannot have remained purely a distant barrage. The trauma pattern points very strongly to close-range violence as well. Multiple individuals suffered blunt force injuries to the skull, fractures of the face, lesions to the neck, fractures of the ribs, and in some cases broken hands and damage to the knees. The original paper argues that at least 3 weapon types were probably involved: projectiles, blunt instruments such as clubs, and another close-range weapon capable of producing sharp force injuries, perhaps something like a hafted stone blade or sharpened implement. Even without accepting every detail of that reconstruction, the variety of injuries makes one thing clear: whoever attacked did not simply fire from afar and leave. Bodies show signs of being struck hard at close quarters. Some of the dead may have already been down when later blows were delivered. Others may have tried to shield themselves. The combination of distance wounds and crushing cranial trauma is exactly the kind of pattern that suggests an encounter moving from ambush or opening attack into direct physical overpowering. A few skeletons make that sequence easier to imagine in a restrained way. One adult male had both an obsidian bladelet embedded in the skull and additional severe cranial damage, along with possible blunt force trauma to the knees. Another male had 2 heavy blows to the head. One woman had fractures to the hand that the original team suggested could be consistent with parrying a blow or breaking a fall. The pregnant woman was found in an unusual seated posture with broken knees, and the excavators suggested that the arrangement of her limbs may indicate restraint. Another young woman was described as reclining on one elbow, again in a posture that does not look like deliberate burial, and again with injuries to the lower limbs. No single body tells the whole story, but taken together they imply movement, collapse, and repeated assaults delivered to different people in different positions. Some may have been shot while upright. Some may have fallen and then been finished at close range. Some may have raised a hand to protect the head. Some may have been immobilized before death or while dying. The site does not let us sort these into exact minute-by-minute steps, but it does show a violent episode that was dynamic rather than uniform. The setting by the lagoon also matters when trying to picture how the group may have been caught. A marshy or lagoon-side margin is productive, but it is not ideal ground for fast, clean escape. Soft substrate, shallow water, reeds, uneven footing, and clustered activity near water all work against an orderly retreat. The original authors emphasised that some bodies seem to have fallen at the edge of the lagoon, and that the unusual preservation came from those conditions. If some of the victims were already close to the shallows when attacked, even a short burst of panic could produce exactly the kinds of positions found at Nataruk. Face down in wet sediment, collapsed awkwardly at the water's edge, or partly supported in strange limb arrangements as the body settled where it dropped. In that kind of terrain, children and the heavily pregnant would be especially disadvantaged. A rich lakeshore gives access to life, but in a sudden attack it also becomes a trap of sorts, narrowing movement and preserving the aftermath with cruel efficiency. That does not tell us whether the attackers had planned the assault in advance, or whether the event grew out of a hostile encounter that escalated very fast. The original Cambridge release actually keeps both possibilities alive. It suggests that the lagoon-side location may have been coveted because it offered water, fishing, and possibly stored foraged food. But it also allows that Nataruk may represent a more standard antagonistic response to an encounter between 2 social groups. Those are not identical scenarios. One is closer to a raid on a desirable camp or resource patch. The other is closer to a meeting between groups that turned lethal. The wounds alone cannot choose between them. What the site does seem to support is that the victims were overwhelmed rather than fighting to a draw, because they were left without burial, and because the demographic mix implies the whole group or a substantial portion of it was caught in the violence. That asymmetry is an important part of the reconstruction. Whatever the motive, the day ended not as an exchange with survivors calmly burying their own, but as a scene where bodies remained exposed until the lagoon environment covered them. The question of restraint sits right at the edge of what we can reconstruct confidently. The published summaries describe 4 bodies whose hand positions may indicate binding, and the pregnant woman's posture is often highlighted in that connection. If those individuals really were bound, then part of the event may have included capture, immobilization, or post-attack coercion, rather than only the chaos of open assault. That would make the day darker in a very specific way, because it would imply control over victims after the first phase of violence. Yet this is also where caution is most necessary. An embedded projectile is harder evidence than a limb position. Bound wrists are an interpretation based on preserved posture, and posture can be affected by settling, decomposition, and local site processes, so the most careful reconstruction is not that captives were definitely tied and executed, but that some bodies lay in positions the excavators regarded as suspicious for restraint, and that, if this reading is correct, the attack may have included moments of subjugation as well as killing. It is worth leaving that as an open but serious possibility, rather than pretending the bones say more than they do. The obsidian also plays a small but interesting part in reconstructing the attackers, though again only at the level of suggestion. The Cambridge release notes that obsidian is rare at other later Stone Age sites in that part of West Turkana, and suggests that this may mean the 2 groups involved had different home ranges. That is not proof of outsiders in the simple dramatic sense, and it certainly does not let us point to a particular source community over the horizon. But it does raise the possibility that the assailants were not simply members of the same small camp, turning on one another with whatever was lying around. The original team took the unusual raw material as one clue among several that this was intergroup violence, rather than interpersonal murder within a single household. That distinction matters for the reconstruction, because it shifts the scene from private quarrel to collective aggression. The attackers, if the original interpretation is right, were probably not just angry individuals. They were another social group, or at least a coordinated subset of one, arriving with weapons and enough advantage to defeat a mixed band at the lakeshore. At this point, the later scholarly challenge has to be brought back in, because any honest reconstruction of the day has to admit that not everyone accepts the same script. Stoyanovsky and colleagues argued in Nature that the evidence for a single massacre event was not secure, questioning whether the bodies were all contemporaneous, whether some of the cranial lesions might reflect soil compression rather than blunt force trauma, and whether body positions might indicate different burial traditions instead of a single unburied event. Arizona State's public summary sharpened that challenge for general readers by saying that perhaps there was no massacre at all. The original team rejected those objections in their reply, insisting that the lesions in question were true traumatic injuries and that the proposed burial tradition alternative did not fit the evidence. For reconstruction, this means we should be careful with claims of exact simultaneity. The strongest version of the original interpretation is a single lethal attack on a living group. The strongest version of the critique is that the scene may not represent one discrete massacre in the way headlines implied. Most readers who stay close to the evidence end up somewhere between those poles. This site clearly records severe interpersonal violence, but the exact temporal tightness of the event remains one of the points under dispute. Even with that caution, there are some things the site makes hard to escape. It is difficult to explain away the embedded and internal projectiles. It is difficult to turn repeated injuries to heads, necks, hands, ribs, and knees across multiple articulated bodies into ordinary environmental damage. It is difficult to interpret the absence of formal burial, together with bodies preserved where they fell at the lagoon margin, as business as usual. And it is difficult to ignore the social composition of the dead, which points toward community-level victimization rather than an isolated duel or hunting accident. So while the phrase, "the day of the attack," carries an unavoidable narrative feel, it is still the most economical way to describe what the original team believed happened. A brief episode, perhaps a raid or sudden hostile encounter, in which a mixed group of foragers was assaulted with projectiles and blunt weapons at the edge of a resource-rich lagoon, and then left there without burial. The details around motive, timing, and the exact number of assailants stay out of reach, but the broader shape holds. What I think archaeology allows us to say, without slipping into fiction, is that the violence was probably fast enough to prevent any meaningful recovery of the dead. That may sound obvious, but it is not trivial. In many prehistoric contexts, even violent death is followed by burial, transport, or some kind of return by survivors. Nataruk instead looks like an interrupted social world. The people there did not receive the later actions that turned bodies into funerary subjects. They remained casualties in place. That suggests either that there were no survivors able to return, or that anyone who did survive could not reclaim the bodies, or that the attackers controlled the scene long enough for abandonment to become permanent. We cannot tell which of those happened, but the lack of deliberate burial is not just a geological detail. It is a social one. It points to the collapse of normal obligations in the wake of the violence. That makes the reconstruction more severe, not less. The event was not only lethal, it was decisive enough to break the ordinary human work of coming back for the dead. So the most grounded reconstruction is also the least theatrical. A small, mixed group of early Holocene foragers was at or near a productive lagoon edge location beside a greener, larger Lake Turkana. Another party encountered them there, either by intention or in a hostile meeting. The violence included projectiles and close-range blows. Several victims seemed to have collapsed where they were struck, some into shallow water or soft marginal sediment. The group was not subsequently buried in a formal way, and the lagoon environment preserved enough of the aftermath for archaeologists to recover it 10,000 years later. Beyond that, the story loosens. We do not know the number of attackers, the exact trigger, or whether the event was a planned raid, a fight over access, or a deadly escalation from an encounter. Those uncertainties matter, and they should remain in view. But even in their presence, Nataruk still asks the same hard question. If a fertile shoreline could become the site of this kind of organised violence among foragers, then what pressures or incentives made that possible? And why would people living without states, cities, or agriculture still have reason to kill as a group? Once you begin to imagine the Nataruk dead as a real group of people, rather than as a row of labelled skeletons, the next question becomes almost unavoidable. Why would anyone do this to them? Why would one group of hunter-gatherers attack another at all? It is a question that sounds simple when asked in modern language, but it becomes slippery very quickly because hunter-gatherers is not a single way of life, and war is not a single kind of event. Some foraging societies are highly mobile, some more settled, some live in very open landscapes, some around rich coasts or lakes, some keep wider ties with neighbours, some keep tense ones, and some do both at once. Anthropologists and archaeologists have argued for decades about whether violence among foragers is rare, common, exaggerated, misunderstood, or simply too variable for one grand answer. That debate has not gone away. Even recent reviews still frame the subject as one of the most persistent arguments in anthropology, precisely because the ethnographic and archaeological records show both peaceful intergroup relationships and real warfare among hunting and gathering peoples. The first thing to clear away is a comforting myth. Mobility does not automatically mean peace. It is easy to think that if people do not farm fixed plots or build permanent stone walls, then they must have little reason to fight over place. But that is not how human landscapes work. Mobile people can still value particular water sources, fishing grounds, marsh edges, game routes, good camps, and seasonal patches that are worth returning to year after year. Nataruk itself sits in exactly that sort of setting. Around 10,000 years ago, it lay beside a fertile lagoon near a much larger Lake Turkana, with easy access to drinking water and fishing, and the Cambridge team explicitly suggested that it may have been a coveted location because of those advantages. They also pointed to pottery as a sign that foraged food could have been stored there. In other words, these people may not have been farmers, but they were not drifting through an empty landscape with nothing to defend, nothing to seize, and no difference between a poor place and a good one. That leads to the most straightforward explanation for violence among foragers, which is competition over resources. Resource competition does not have to mean total famine. In fact, some of the strongest arguments in the Nataruk case run in the opposite direction. Mirazon Lair's team proposed that the attack may have involved attempts to seize territory, women, children, or food stored in pots, and they emphasised that the lagoon-side location would have been materially attractive. More generally, archaeological work on prehistoric hunter-gatherer violence has found links between lethal aggression and ecological pressure. A 2016 PNAS study of prehistoric Central California hunter-gatherers concluded that violence there was better explained by resource scarcity than by political organisation, arguing that environmental productivity was a stronger predictor of lethal aggression than settlement hierarchy or centralised authority. That does not mean all violence starts in hunger, and it certainly does not mean every green landscape is peaceful, while every dry one is murderous. It means that access to useful things, whether abundant but patchy or genuinely scarce, can give groups reasons to threaten, raid, exclude, or strike preemptively. Humans do not need a tax office and a border post to understand that a productive place matters. There is also a second, less obvious version of the same problem. Sometimes people fight not because there is too little in general, but because there is one place that is much better than the alternatives. A marshy lake shore, a salmon run, a stand of fruiting trees, a dry season water source, or a protected camp beside a lagoon can become the sort of place that several groups know about and would all prefer to use. In that situation, even relatively mobile people can become territorial in practice, whether or not they think about territory in the later legal sense. A productive patch creates expectations. It becomes part of the annual round. Children grow up knowing it. Older people remember when it was last good. A neighbouring band may have its own memory of it. That is enough to create tension. Nataruk is persuasive partly because the environment was not random backdrop. The people there were living beside a place worth inhabiting, and the original team said exactly that when they suggested that the lagoon-side location may have been coveted by others. Still, resources alone are not the whole answer, because humans are not calculators who only fight when a spreadsheet says the fish are low. Another major reason for intergroup violence among small-scale societies is retaliation. One killing can demand another. One raid can invite a counter-raid. One theft, abduction, or insult can create a memory that is socially expensive to ignore. This is not just modern speculation projected backward. Research on non-state societies has long emphasised revenge and deterrence as central parts of violent cycles, and work on blood revenge in the Warani has shown how lethal retaliation can become deeply embedded in male life histories. More broadly, theories of revenge stress that retaliation can function as deterrence, imposing costs on aggressors so that future attacks become less attractive. That logic does not require written law or formal states. In some ways it works even more directly without them, because there is no higher institution reliably stepping in to settle the score. If your group cannot count on courts, police, or an outside power to protect it, then reputation for retaliation can become a form of security. That same point helps explain why warfare can persist even when it is costly and frightening. Peace is not simply the absence of reasons to fight. Peace requires conditions that make restraint safer than aggression. A recent broad review on the evolution of peace argues that peace is often difficult to achieve because the same capacities that support cooperation within groups can also support conflict between them. That is one of the most uncomfortable features of human sociality. The ability to organise, trust allies, punish defectors and act together can save lives, feed children, build camps, and at the same time make raiding possible. The skills are not morally sorted in advance. They are just social capacities, and they can be used for care or for violence depending on the problem being solved. So when we ask why hunter-gatherers would go to war, part of the answer is that they are exactly the kind of intensely cooperative animal that can do so. They can assemble coalitions, divide risk, coordinate movement, and act on shared grievances. This is where the imbalance of power idea becomes useful. Wrangham and Glowacki's well-known 2012 review argues that one important pattern in chimpanzee and nomadic hunter-gatherer intergroup aggression is risk-averse killing, when the attackers have a strong advantage and the danger to themselves is low. Their broader point is not that humans are simply chimpanzees with better tools. In fact, they emphasize real differences, including the human ability to form peaceful ties and alliances across groups. But they still argue that a good starting point for thinking about warfare is the idea that coalitions may attack when success looks safe enough. That matters for Nataruk because the victims do not look like an evenly matched war party. They look like a mixed group with women, small children, and a heavily pregnant woman. If another group approached them with numbers, surprise, or better position, then the balance of power would have been badly uneven from the beginning. In that kind of situation, violence does not have to arise from mutual madness. It can arise from a very cold assessment that the other side is vulnerable. And vulnerability is not only physical, it is social. A mixed foraging group at a camp or shoreline has more to protect and fewer clean options. Children slow movement. Pregnancy slows movement. Care obligations change who can run, who can fight, and who must stay close to whom. If attackers know that, then a small camp is not just a source of goods. It is an opportunity structured by dependency. This may be why the original Nataruk team floated not only territory and food, but also women and children as possible objectives. That suggestion can sound harsh to modern ears, but it fits a very old anthropological reality. People themselves are resources in human conflict. Women can be abducted, children absorbed, labour captured, kinship lines reshaped. None of that requires large states. It only requires groups that understand the value of people as well as places. The Cambridge team was careful to frame this as a possibility rather than a proven motive, but it remains one of the more plausible reasons why an attack on a mixed group might be worthwhile to aggressors. There is also a demographic and reproductive angle that scholars of small-scale warfare keep returning to, although it needs to be handled with care because it explains some cases much better than others. Studies of contemporary and recent small-scale societies have found that participation in raiding can, in some settings, be tied to status and long-term reproductive success. A PNAS study on warfare and reproductive success in a tribal population concluded that raiding in that context provided opportunities for increased lifetime reproductive success, and related work on blood revenge among the Waorani found that highly aggressive men could gain social and marital advantages even while paying severe costs in survival. This does not mean men everywhere are secretly doing arithmetic about offspring before every fight. It means that in some social systems, successful aggression can translate into prestige, alliances, marriage opportunities, and political influence. When that happens, violence is not only about defending food or land. It can also become part of how some people pursue standing. But here again, it is important not to overlearn the lesson. One of the reasons the hunter-gatherer violence debate has stayed alive is that different data sets support different emphases. Some scholars argue that mobile foragers have often been portrayed as more warlike than the evidence justifies. Fry and Söderberg, for example, explicitly critiqued claims that nomadic foragers are generally warlike, arguing against broad generalizations drawn from selective samples. More recent work continues to describe the issue as contested rather than settled. This is not academic fussiness for its own sake. It matters because hunter-gatherer covers an enormous range of ecologies and social arrangements. Some groups maintain broad exchange relationships and peaceful visiting. Some avoid conflict by fissioning, moving away, or relying on mediation. Some live under pressure from pastoralists, farmers, or states, which changes their behaviour in ways that are not good models for the deep past. So the better question is not, are hunter-gatherers warlike? The better question is, under what conditions do some hunter-gatherers engage in organised violence, and under what conditions do they avoid it? That better question leads straight to social institutions, because even small-scale war usually requires more than anger. It requires organisation. Somebody has to recruit others, share information, accept the risk, and prevent free riding. Work on the Turkana, a pastoral rather than foraging society but still a useful non-state comparison, is instructive here. Matthew and Boyd showed that the Turkana sustained costly cooperation in combat partly through punishment of free riders. The point is not that Nataruk had Turkana-style institutions. It is that human groups without centralised states can still solve the problem of getting individuals to show up and fight. Social pressure, reputation, norms, obligation to kin, and punishment for cowardice or non-participation can all make coalitionary violence possible at scales larger than one hot-headed person and his immediate friends. Once you remember that, warfare no longer looks like something requiring bureaucracy to exist. It only requires social mechanisms strong enough to coordinate risk. Humans are very good at building those mechanisms. There is a further complication though, and it cuts the other way. Hunter-gatherers are not isolated little atoms, each band cut off from all others until war breaks out. Research on Ache and Hadza interband interaction rates found surprisingly high probabilities of cooperative and cultural interactions between adults across distinct residential bands, with estimated yearly probabilities of 5% to 29% depending on context. The broader point of that study was about cumulative culture, but it carries an important side lesson for violence. Foragers often know outsiders. They visit, exchange, learn, marry, gossip and maintain ties beyond the residential group. Those same wider networks can reduce violence by making strangers less strange, by offering paths of mediation, and by allowing people to vote with their feet and shift residence rather than fight. But those same networks can also create larger fields of rivalry, obligations of support, and opportunities for coalition building. In human social life, connection can cool conflict or widen it. It can do both. This double effect is one reason peace among foragers can be real without being guaranteed. Humans have unusually flexible intergroup relationships. Wrangham and Glowacki explicitly note that compared with chimpanzees, humans have the capacity to form peaceful relationships and alliances among groups. That is a major difference, and it matters for any honest reading of the deep past. Nataruk should not be used to claim that all early humans were constantly raiding one another, any more than a peaceful exchange network should be used to claim that violence was absent. The more realistic picture is that our species has long had both capacities. We can widen trust beyond the local group, and we can also decide that another group is dangerous, vulnerable, offensive, or worth exploiting. Which side wins out depends on ecology, recent history, group composition, expected payoffs, and whether mechanisms of peace are stronger than mechanisms of fear and revenge. That is exactly why Nataruk matters. The site does not prove that war was universal among foragers. It does something more careful and more important. It shows that organised lethal violence against a mixed group of foragers was possible in the early Holocene, and that such violence could target an entire small community rather than only adult males. The Cambridge team's own phrasing is useful here. They said Nataruk provides evidence that warfare was part of the repertoire of intergroup relations among some prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Some is doing good scientific work in that sentence. It avoids the mistake of turning one shoreline in Kenya into a complete theory of human nature. But it also avoids the opposite mistake of pretending that war had to wait for agriculture, states, or formal property. So why would hunter-gatherers go to war? Because mobility does not erase valuable places. Because rich patches can be worth seizing. Because scarcity and patchiness both create pressure. Because revenge can be safer than looking weak. Because coalitionary violence becomes possible when one side judges the odds to be favourable. because social pressure can organise dangerous cooperation, because in some settings violent success can bring status, allies or reproductive advantage, because people themselves can be taken, not only things, and because the same deeply human capacities that make us cooperative within groups can make us dangerous to other groups when peace breaks down. None of these explanations needs to be the only one, and in a real event they may have overlapped. A raid can be about food and deterrence. A retaliatory strike can also seize people. A fight over a shoreline can be intensified by old grievances. Human motives rarely line up in tidy single file. What Nataruk gives us then is not a neat answer, but a narrower field of honest possibilities. A fertile shoreline beside a larger, greener Lake Turkana was worth using. A mixed group of foragers was there. Another group appears to have met them with projectiles and close-range force. The victims were not buried afterward. Whether the motive was seizure, rivalry, retaliation, opportunism, or some combination of those, the site tells us that hunter-gatherers did not need farms and kings before they could kill collectively. They only needed the old human ingredients: groups, interests, memories, fear, opportunity, and a moment when restraint failed or was never even attempted. And once that possibility is allowed into the story, the next problem becomes sharper, because if Nataruk may record one of the earliest clear cases of this kind of violence, we still have to ask whether it really deserves the larger word that so many headlines rush to use. The reason Nataruk drew so much attention is not simply that it is old. Prehistoric violence was not invented by that shoreline in Kenya, and the archaeologists who excavated the site did not claim otherwise. What made the find so important was the combination of age, context, and the specific pattern of evidence. In the original 2016 paper, Marta Mirason-La and colleagues argued that Nataruk preserves a case of intergroup violence against early Holocene hunter-gatherers living beside a lagoon west of Lake Turkana, at a time when the lake extended far beyond its present shoreline. Their strongest claim was not just that some people had died violently long ago, but that a mixed group of foragers, including men, women, and children, appeared to have been attacked and left without deliberate burial, with 10 of the 12 articulated skeletons showing violent trauma. That matters because oldest evidence of war is never really about who first hit whom in deep time. It is about when the archaeological record first gives us something that looks unmistakably like organised, group-level lethal violence, rather than an isolated murder, a hunting accident, or a scattered set of injuries collected over centuries. Nataruk mattered because it seemed, at least to its excavators, to cross that threshold very clearly. To see why the claim looks so strong in 2016, it helps to separate 3 different categories that are often blurred together in popular writing: interpersonal violence, collective violence, and war. Interpersonal violence can be very old indeed. The 2021 reanalysis of Jebel Sahaba notes an even older documented case from Wadi Kubenia, roughly 20,000 years ago, involving a partial skeleton of a young adult male with evidence of interpersonal violence. But one injured individual is not war. A cemetery containing many people with weapon-related trauma gets much closer, especially if those injuries point to recurring attacks or a single deadly confrontation. That is where Jebel Sahaba, in Sudan, has long been central to the debate. The Jebel Sahaba reanalysis says the site contains the remains of 61 individuals and remains one of the earliest substantial records of violence in the Nile Valley. At the same time, the authors explicitly reject the old interpretation of Jebel Sahaba as one single warfare event, arguing instead for sporadic and recurrent episodes of interpersonal violence over time. So even though Jebel Sahaba is older, it no longer serves quite so neatly as a one-off massacre scene. Nataruk, by contrast, was argued to preserve something more discrete, more scene-like, and more directly legible as a single violent episode affecting a whole living group. That distinction between older violence and older evidence of war is where the case for Nataruk really begins. Jebel Sahaba is at least 13.4 thousand years old, and probably older than that. which means it predates Nataruk by several millennia. But the same 2021 study says its evidence now supports repeated violent episodes rather than a single showdown or cemetery of one battle. That makes Jebel Sahaba crucial for the history of violence, yet somewhat less straightforward as the earliest archaeological snapshot of one specific act of organised killing. Nataruk's excavators leaned on exactly this difference. The University of Cambridge release stated that the Sudanese evidence was the only comparable case then often cited, but argued it involved cemetery burials and a more settled lifestyle, whereas Nataruk represented largely nomadic hunter-gatherers whose bodies had not been deliberately buried after the attack. In that narrower sense, the claim was not, "No site older than Nataruk shows violence." It was no older site showed this particular package of evidence so clearly in a non-cemetery context among prehistoric foragers. That is a more defensible statement, and it explains why the headline became so strong so quickly. Another part of the case lies in who the dead were. At Nataruk, the remains represent a mixed group including adult men, adult women, juveniles, and a woman in the late stages of pregnancy. That demographic profile is one of the strongest reasons the site was read as more than a clash between a few aggressive individuals. The Cambridge summary described the dead as the intentional killing of a small band of foragers, with no deliberate burial afterward. In archaeological terms, that matters because community-level victimization is one of the things that pushes violence toward the category of warfare or raiding, rather than private homicide. If the dead were only a handful of adult males, a narrower reading would remain easier. A hunting dispute, a male feud, a broken alliance meeting, perhaps even a string of unrelated killings later brought together by burial. But the inclusion of children and women makes the assemblage look much more like an attack reaching into the whole social body of a small group. This is not proof by itself, but it is the kind of context that strengthens the interpretation of warlike violence rather than merely individual aggression. The bodies do not represent a dueling club, they represent a camp-sized portion of human life. The injuries strengthen that reading further because they are patterned and cumulative. The original paper reported that 10 of the 12 articulated skeletons showed evidence of violent death. These included blunt force trauma to skulls, sharp force lesions to the head and neck, fractures to hands and ribs, damage to knees, and most strikingly projectile evidence, including an obsidian bladelet embedded in one skull and microliths associated with another individual's body cavity. The authors described these as evidence of more than one weapon type, and argued that the bodies preserve the aftermath of a direct and lethal encounter. This matters for the oldest evidence of war claim because archaeologists are always trying to distinguish between old trauma and true conflict scenes. A few fractures can be explained many ways. A cluster of bodies, many articulated, many unburied, with multiple forms of perimortem trauma and embedded projectiles, is much harder to explain away as chance or ordinary site damage. That does not make the interpretation beyond dispute, but it does explain why Nataruk seemed unusually strong compared with earlier or less complete finds. The case rests not on one spectacular wound, but on a whole suite of mutually reinforcing observations. The setting also did important work in the argument. Nataruk was not a cemetery in the normal sense. According to the 2016 paper, the articulated bodies were preserved by lagoon conditions, and there was no evidence of deliberate burial. Some appear to have died at the edge of the lagoon and to have been covered by sediments later. That lack of deliberate burial is one of the reasons the site feels so immediate, and why the excavators treated it as a frozen aftermath rather than as a funerary assemblage gathered over time. Cemeteries can preserve excellent evidence of violence, but cemeteries also involve survivor behaviour. People may retrieve bodies from different events, return them to one place, rebury individuals years apart, or create symbolic arrangements that compress time. Nataruk seemed, at least in the original interpretation, to bypass much of that filtering. The shoreline appeared to preserve the dead where they fell. That makes the scene archaeologically powerful, because it looks less like a curated memory of violence and more like violence itself. For anyone trying to identify early war rather than just early violent injury, that difference is enormous. It is one thing to say prehistoric people sometimes buried the injured. It is another to say a prehistoric attack site was preserved in situ. A further reason the site looks so important is that it seemed to challenge a long-standing model of when war begins. The original Nature paper opened by noting that the existence of warfare before sedentary societies was disputed. That sentence goes straight to the larger debate. Many older models place true warfare after, or at least strongly alongside, increasing sedentism, agriculture, storage, fixed property, and more formal social hierarchy. Nataruk complicated that picture because the victims were interpreted as hunter-gatherers, living in a rich lakeshore environment, not members of a state or a farming village. The Cambridge release stated plainly that the remains offer evidence that warfare was part of the repertoire of intergroup relations among some prehistoric hunter-gatherers. That wording was careful. It did not say all hunter-gatherers everywhere were at war. But it did say that organised lethal intergroup violence did not need to wait for farms and kings. In the argument over oldest evidence of war, that made Nataruk doubly significant. It was not only early, it was early in the kind of society many people had assumed would rarely produce such violence. There is also a narrower but important point about what the claim actually meant at the time it was made. The Cambridge release did not present Nataruk as the oldest known human violence in any absolute sense. It called it the earliest record of intergroup violence among prehistoric hunter-gatherers who were largely nomadic. That phrase matters. It narrows the claim to a specific social form and to a specific kind of evidence. Even in 2016, there were older cases of interpersonal violence, and at least one older, often cited cemetery of violent death in the Nile Valley. The claim for Nataruk was strongest because the bodies were not formally buried, the victims appear to represent a mobile foraging group, and the site looked like a direct conflict scene rather than a funerary accumulation. In other words, what Nataruk seemed to offer was not the first human war in some cosmic sense, but one of the earliest unusually clear archaeological signatures of a group attack on foragers in place. That may sound like a smaller achievement, but it is actually the more scientifically useful one. Big universal claims are easy to say and hard to prove. Tight claims about what kind of evidence a site preserves are stronger. Of course, this is exactly where the challenge arrived. Later in 2016, Christopher Stojanovsky and colleagues published a critique in Nature, arguing that the inference of intergroup warfare at Nataruk was premature. Their objections focused on three pillars of the original interpretation: whether the skeletons were truly contemporaneous, whether the bodies had really been left unburied, and whether most of the cranial damage was genuinely perimortem, blunt force trauma rather than the result of later site processes. If those criticisms were right, then Nataruk would become less secure as the earliest clear case of war, because its strongest advantage over cemetery sites like Jebel Sahaba was precisely the claim that it captured one discrete unburied event. Mirzonlar and colleagues replied in the same journal and defended their interpretation, maintaining that the fractures and lesions were traumatic and that the site still represented intergroup violence. The debate did not erase Nataruk's importance, but it did change how careful one has to be with the label. Once the critique entered the literature, oldest evidence of war stopped being a simple statement and became an argument with conditions attached. That is why, from a present-day perspective, the strongest case for Nataruk is narrower and more careful than the original headlines. Jebel Sahaba is older and, after reanalysis, still represents one of the earliest and most substantial records of violence among late Pleistocene hunter-fisher-gatherers in the Nile Valley. But its authors now interpret the cemetery as evidence of repeated violent episodes, rather than one single massacre or battle. Nataruk, if the original excavation team is substantially right, remains one of the clearest early archaeological scenes of a specific lethal group attack on foragers left unburied at the place of death. That does not automatically make it the oldest evidence of war under every possible definition, because definitions matter a great deal here. Some scholars reserve war for repeated socially recognised conflict between groups. Others allow a single raid or massacre if it is clearly collective and intentional. A 2023 review in the Journal of Peace Research notes that disagreement over prehistoric war often stems from varying definitions and from the problem of grouping together nomadic foragers with more complex hunter-gatherers. Under a looser definition, older sites may qualify. Under a stricter event-focused definition, Nataruk remains unusually compelling. So the real case for Nataruk is built from clarity more than from raw age. It is old enough to matter enormously, dated to roughly 9,500 to 10,500 years ago. It preserves a mixed group of victims rather than a narrow male subset. It includes multiple forms of violent trauma, including projectile evidence. It appears, according to the original excavation team, to preserve bodies left where they died, without deliberate burial. And it belongs to a foraging lakeshore setting, which challenged the assumption that warfare belongs only to later, more settled life. Put those things together and you can see why the site was introduced as a landmark in the history of organised violence. At the same time, if we are being exact, it is safer today to say that Nataruk is one of the earliest and clearest candidate cases of intergroup warfare among prehistoric hunter-gatherers, rather than to pretend the title is settled beyond dispute. In archaeology, the strongest discoveries are often not the ones that close the argument forever. They are the ones that force everybody else to refine what they mean by the argument in the first place. Nataruk did that. It made oldest evidence of war a much sharper question than it had been before, and that is why the next step in the story is not triumph but dispute. Because once a site becomes this important, every fracture, date, and body position gets dragged into the debate. What makes Nataruk especially interesting is that the most dramatic part of its story did not happen 10,000 years ago. It happened in 2016, in journals, university press offices, and among archaeologists who looked at the same site and reached sharply different conclusions. That is often how major discoveries really work. A paper appears, the public gets a clean headline, and then the people closest to the methods begin doing what scientists are supposed to do, which is to ask whether the evidence really supports the largest claim being made. In January 2016, the Cambridge-led team published Nataruk as evidence of intergroup violence among early Holocene hunter-gatherers, arguing that a small mixed group had been attacked at the edge of a lagoon and left without deliberate burial. The University of Cambridge release went even further for general readers, calling it the earliest scientifically dated historical evidence of human conflict, and saying the site showed warfare as part of the repertoire of intergroup relations among some prehistoric hunter-gatherers. By November of the same year, a formal challenge had appeared in Nature, and Nataruk had become not just an archaeological site, but a test case for how far one can push ancient bones into a claim about the origins of war. The central disagreement was not really about whether violence existed in the deep past. Almost nobody in the dispute was claiming that 10,000 years ago was a peaceful cartoon world where everyone shared fish and never argued. The dispute was about classification, whether Nataruk remains best understood as the aftermath of a single group attack, something massacre-like and minimally warlike, or were the bones being made to carry more narrative weight than they should? Christopher Stoyanovsky and colleagues framed their challenge around three main inferences in the original paper: that the skeletons were contemporaneous, that the bodies had been left unburied, and that most of the observed injuries represented perimortem trauma caused by interpersonal violence. Their argument was that these points were not securely demonstrated, and if they failed, then the dramatic warfare interpretation weakened substantially. This is one of those scientific disputes where the whole structure rests on a few key supports. Remove one support, and the story becomes less certain. Remove two or three, and it changes genre entirely. The first point of attack was the trauma itself, especially the cranial injuries. The original team had interpreted several skull lesions as blunt force trauma consistent with violent blows. The critics argued that the fracture patterns did not match what forensic osteology would normally expect from that kind of impact, In the SU summary of the critique, Stoyanovsky's group said that if the skulls had truly been broken by blows to the head, one would expect fractures radiating from impact points in particular ways, or following structurally weaker areas of the skull. Instead, they said, the Nataruk skulls showed grid-like cracking and breaks crossing reinforced parts of the cranium, which they regarded as more consistent with post-depositional compression by soil, especially in a setting that had experienced wetting and drying. This was not a casual objection. It went to the heart of the visual evidence that had made the site so convincing to many readers in the first place. A broken skull on a journal cover is powerful, but if the break comes from sediment pressure rather than a club, the emotional force remains while the interpretation changes completely. The second major objection concerned burial and site formation. The original authors had argued that the articulated bodies were preserved by the lagoon environment and that there was no evidence of deliberate burial. That lack of formal burial was one of the strongest reasons Nataruk was treated as a frozen conflict scene rather than as a cemetery. The critics pushed in the opposite direction. According to the ASU summary, they argued that the layout of the skeletons showed a degree of organisation and intentional positioning that was inconsistent with enemy corpses simply left where they fell. They also pointed to chronological variation, saying that the face-down bodies were older than some of the side-lying ones, which suggested different death episodes and possibly changing mortuary practice through time. Put simply, they asked whether Nataruk might not be a massacre scene at all, but a mortuary place used repeatedly, where burial styles shifted over time, and where later, environmental processes added damage that was then mistaken for violence. That alternative reading was far less cinematic, but it was archaeologically serious. A burial ground can look disorderly after erosion, and changing mortuary behaviour can produce body positions that seem strange if one expects a single event. This is where the debate became especially interesting, because the two sides were not only disagreeing about what happened in prehistory, they were disagreeing about how to read damaged evidence in the present. The Cambridge team saw a shoreline attack preserved in place. The critics saw a site whose taphonomy, chronology and mortuary signals had not been separated carefully enough. That distinction matters more than it may seem. Archaeology is not just about recovering objects. It is about reconstructing processes from incomplete traces. When skeletons are partially exposed, when gullies have moved fragments, when sediments have compressed bones, and when some bodies are articulated while others are scattered, interpretation becomes a problem of sequence. Which came first? Injury, burial, compression, dismemberment, weathering, reuse of space, or exposure? At Nataruk, both sides accepted that the site was important. They disagreed about the order and meaning of those processes. In that sense, the dispute was not peripheral to the site. It was the site translated into method. The original team responded quickly and firmly. In their Nature reply, Mirazon La and colleagues said the critique rested on two arguments. First, that lesions in 3 crania were due to soil compression, and second, that body position correlated with age in a way that reflected different burial traditions. They rejected both. Their response emphasized that at least one of the skulls used by the critics as an example of soil compression had 2 primary lesions, making a simple site-wide compression explanation less plausible. More broadly, they argued that the suspected trauma was localized rather than expressed as a generalized distortion across the crania, and that the unaffected areas of the same skulls retained original size and shape, which did not fit the proposed sediment pressure explanation. In plainer terms, they were saying that the broken parts looked too focused to be explained by the kind of crushing that usually affects a skull more diffusely. They also rejected the age and body position argument, maintaining that the remains did not show a meaningful correlation that would support separate burial traditions. Their conclusion was direct. A case of intergroup conflict remained the best explanation of the events at Nataruk. What makes this exchange unusually useful is that each side exposed the other's weak points rather than simply shouting past them. The critics forced the original team to defend its trauma criteria and its site formation model more explicitly. The original team forced the critics to confront the embedded and associated projectile evidence, the lack of clear formal burial structures, and the cumulative pattern of injuries across multiple bodies. Even the ASU summary of the dispute, which was naturally sympathetic to the critique, acknowledged that there was at least one skeleton with an obsidian projectile embedded in bone. That is not a small concession. It means the skeptical side was not claiming a peaceful cemetery free of violence. Their position was subtler. Murder was not unheard of, they said, but massacre and warfare were stronger labels than the evidence securely justified. That is a very different claim from saying nothing violent happened here. It is a dispute about scale, coherence, and confidence, not about whether ancient people ever hurt one another. There is also a quieter issue sitting underneath the whole argument, and that is the role of expectation. Nataruk landed with such force because it seemed to violate a model many anthropologists and general readers still found intuitive, that systematic warfare belongs mainly to more settled societies, with durable property, territorial boundaries, and denser hierarchy. The ASU article says this quite plainly when it notes that many anthropologists believe humans did not engage in this systematic form of warfare until they started living in settlements, because mobile people had less need to defend fixed resources. That background expectation does not prove the critics right, of course, but it helps explain why the site drew unusually strong scrutiny. Nataruk was not just another old site under review. It was a site being asked to carry part of the larger argument about human nature, social evolution, and when war begins. Discoveries placed under that much conceptual pressure are almost guaranteed to become battlegrounds of interpretation. It is difficult for any one set of bones to survive being recruited into such a large philosophical war without every fracture being inspected twice. The later literature did not settle the argument so much as absorb it. A 2021 reanalysis of Jebel Sahaba, the older Nile Valley site often compared with Nataruk, offers a good example of how the debate continued to shape broader discussions. That paper treats Nataruk as an early Holocene case whose evidence has been debated, and then distinguishes it from Jebel Sahaba by noting that Nataruk lacks clear deliberate burial, shows no healed trauma in adults, and appears to record violent death through projectile marks, sharp force trauma, blunt force trauma, and fractures. At the same time, the Jebel Sahaba authors reject the idea that their own cemetery represents one catastrophic single warfare event, arguing instead for recurring episodes of interpersonal or intergroup violence over a shorter timescale. That comparison matters because it shows the field moving toward greater caution. Archaeologists are increasingly willing to say that early collective violence existed while still resisting the temptation to package every dramatic site as one clean massacre or one clean war. Nataruk remains central to that conversation precisely because it is both compelling and contested. A 2023 review in the Journal of Peace Research captures the status of the debate rather well. It treats Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba as prominent pre-Neolithic cases that perhaps indicate collective violence, but it also stresses that definitional ambiguity cannot be avoided. The review notes that war requires violence between distinct groups and more than one participant, yet also points out that raids and feuds in hunter-gatherer contexts can be both group-like and partly interpersonal, making them hard to classify with complete confidence. In its summary of Nataruk specifically, the review records the original claim that the deaths testify to the antiquity of intergroup violence and war, notes Stojanovsky's objection that most of the cranial damage is inconsistent with blunt force trauma, and then notes Mirazonlar's reply that intergroup conflict remains the best explanation. That is about as neat a snapshot of the scholarly position as one could ask for. The site has not been thrown out, nor has the original claim become untouchable orthodoxy. It sits in that more realistic and less comfortable place where important evidence continues to be argued over, because the stakes are high and the traces are imperfect. There is something healthy in that, even if it frustrates anyone hoping for a simple final verdict. Popular history likes a single sentence. Archaeology rarely deserves one. a site like Nataruk is built from fragile bones, exposed by erosion, interpreted through forensic criteria, dated by multiple methods, and understood only by combining taphonomy, osteology, sedimentology, mortuary archaeology, and broader comparison with other sites. When two groups of experienced scholars disagree under those conditions, that does not mean the science is broken. It means the science is doing its job in public view. Stoyanovsky himself said the debate was healthy and solvable as more data come to light, and added that it would be a shame if the warfare story overshadowed the larger opportunity to study the lives of East African hunter-gatherers in an understudied region. That is a good corrective. The argument over massacre versus cemetery versus some more complicated intermediate explanation is important, but so are the people themselves, their biology, their environment, their technologies, and the broader human context in which they lived. Sometimes a dramatic label can narrow a site as much as it elevates it. At the same time, caution should not drift into false balance. Not every interpretation in archaeology is equally strong just because two teams disagree. The skeptical reading at Nataruk raises real and substantial issues, especially about cranial fracture diagnosis, body position, and whether one can safely leap from surface disorder to massacre. But the original interpretation still has serious weight behind it because of the cumulative pattern of evidence. Articulated bodies at a lagoon margin, no clear deliberate burial for those key individuals, projectile evidence, multiple forms of trauma, and a mixed victim group including women and children. That combination is why later reviews still treat Nataruk as a prominent possible case of early collective violence rather than as an archaeological embarrassment best forgotten. In practical terms, the site remains too difficult for a simple dismissal and too disputed for a triumphant slogan. That middle state is not weakness. It is what real evidence often looks like after the headlines fade. What the Nataruk dispute finally reveals is that archaeological arguments are often arguments about thresholds. How much trauma is enough to infer massacre rather than repeated burial? How much body disorder is enough to infer abandonment rather than mortuary variation? How much chronological spread is enough to dissolve a single event? How much uncertainty can remain before the word war becomes too ambitious? None of those thresholds come with universal numbers stamped on them. They are interpretive judgments built from method, comparison, and disciplinary habits. That is why reasonable specialists can look at the same site and still disagree. One team sees a threshold crossed, another says not yet. And because the evidence matters beyond the site itself, the disagreement becomes larger than any one skull or limb. It becomes a disagreement about how confidently we can read collective violence into the early human past at all. So where does that leave Nataruk now? Not abandoned, not settled, and not nearly as simple as the original news cycle suggested. It remains one of the most important early Holocene sites for thinking about violence among foragers. It also remains one of the clearest reminders that important and certain are not the same thing. The original team still stands by intergroup conflict as the best explanation. The critics remain unconvinced. Later reviews continue to cite both the claim and the rebuttal. In that sense, the archaeologists' dispute has become part of the site itself. Nataruk is no longer only an ancient place beside a vanished lagoon. It is also a modern case study in how science handles dramatic evidence, when the evidence is strong enough to matter and imperfect enough to argue over. And that is useful, because the next question does not ask us to pick a winning team so much as to step back and ask what, even with all this uncertainty, the site can still tell us about the range of human behaviour and about the danger of using one ancient shoreline to explain human nature too quickly. Nataruk does not give us a neat answer to the oldest question people ask when they look at ancient violence. It does not tell us whether humans are good or bad, peaceful or brutal, fallen from grace or slowly climbing out of some darker beginning. Archaeological sites almost never settle questions that large, and when we ask them to, we usually end up learning more about our own need for simple stories than about the people in the ground. What Nataruk can do, and what it does very well, is narrow the range of honest things we can say about ourselves. The original publication framed the site carefully as evidence that warfare, or at least organised intergroup violence, was part of the repertoire of relations among some prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Not all of them, not everywhere, not at every moment, but some. That small word matters. It means the site does not force a grand universal law onto human nature. It does something both more modest and more unsettling. It shows that people living without cities, states, or agriculture could still organise lethal violence against another group, and could do so in a way that reached men, women, and children alike. That already tells us something important. It tells us that war does not require the full machinery we often associate with it later on. You do not need bureaucracy, walls, uniforms, and scribes recording the dead before human beings can kill collectively. You need groups. You need shared interest. You need enough coordination for several people to act together. You need some reason, whether immediate or remembered, to see another group as a threat, a rival, or an opportunity. Nataruk matters because it puts all of that very far back in time in a shoreline world of fish, reeds, lagoons, and mobile foragers. The people there were not primitive in the lazy sense of being socially simple or morally unformed. They were fully human, which means they were capable of care, planning, cooperation, memory, and, under some conditions, organised violence. The site does not reveal a separate category of ancient people who are somehow rougher material than us. It reveals us in an earlier setting carrying capacities that are still familiar. That is where many discussions become clumsy, because the temptation is to go straight from humans could do this to humans are naturally this way. Nataruk resists that jump. One sight, however vivid, cannot tell us that violence is inevitable, constant, or built into every social arrangement in the same form. In fact, part of the modern literature on peace argues almost the opposite kind of simplification is equally misleading. Recent work on the evolution of peace emphasises that intergroup cooperation is likely universal across human societies, including societies that also experience war and violence, and that the very factors enabling peace can also facilitate the scale and destructiveness of conflict. That is a deeply human pattern. The capacities that let people trust one another, coordinate, share risk, punish rule breakers, and act as a group are the same capacities that can produce alliance, ritual exchange, hospitality, and protection. They are also the capacities that can support raiding, retaliation, and massacre. In other words, cooperation and violence are not opposite substances stored in different corners of the human soul. They are often built from the same social ingredients. This is one of the most useful things Nataruk teaches if we let it. Human nature is probably less like a single moral tendency, and more like a range of social possibilities. We are creatures who build bonds fast and deeply. We divide the world into people we must care for and people we may fear. We pass on memory. We develop obligations. We get attached to places, to routines, to water sources, to familiar camps, to kin, to reputations. All of that makes large-scale cooperation possible, and all of that also creates the conditions under which other groups can become dangerous in imagination, or in fact. The old argument between the peaceful savage story and the humans are born for war story has lasted so long because each side notices something real and then pushes too far. Nataruk pushes against the fantasy that organised violence had to wait for farming, but it also pushes against the opposite fantasy that a single prehistoric attack lets us read all of humanity as permanently warlike. The 2023 review on the prehistory of violence says the rhetoric still swings between those poles, with conclusions fluctuating widely between Hobbesian and Rousseauan pictures of the past. Nataruk is one reason it keeps swinging. It is dramatic enough to tempt overstatement, and ambiguous enough to punish it. There is another lesson in the composition of the dead themselves. Because the victims include women, small children, and a pregnant woman, The site strips away some of the convenient stories people like to tell about violence being a contained male activity that can be separated neatly from ordinary life. At Nataruk, if the original interpretation is right, violence did not sit politely on the edge of society while domestic life went on elsewhere. It tore through the middle of a living group. That matters because it reminds us that once collective violence begins, it rarely stays within the tidy boundaries imagined by later political language. A group under attack is not a chessboard. It is a mesh of dependence. Someone is carrying a child, someone is heavily pregnant, someone is older, someone is slower, someone turns back instead of running because another person cannot run. Human vulnerability is not evenly distributed, and organised violence often exploits that fact. Nataruk does not just show that humans can kill, it shows that humans can direct violence into the ordinary structure of care itself. That is one of the hardest things to look at in the site, and one of the reasons it still matters. At the same time, the site does not let us pretend that violence is the only deep human inheritance. The very existence of a mixed group living together at a fertile lakeshore speaks just as strongly of cooperation. These people, whatever their exact relationships, were surviving by sharing knowledge, moving together, caring for children, protecting the vulnerable, and organising daily life in a demanding environment. A foraging group with children and a pregnant woman is not a random pile of individuals. It is a successful social unit. It exists because humans are good at more than aggression. They're good at belonging. They're good at making small societies work. That is what can be missed when ancient violence is treated as a shortcut to human essence. Nataruk shows us lethal coalitionary behaviour, yes, but it also quietly proves the opposite side of the same species. Before the attack there had to be a functioning community. Before the final injuries there had to be food sharing, movement, memory and repeated acts of care. The bones preserve the catastrophe, not the thousands of small cooperative moments that made those lives possible up to that point. Archaeology is often unfair that way. It remembers the break more clearly than the routine. That unfairness matters because many claims about human nature are really claims about what the evidence happens to preserve well. Violence can leave marks in bone, peace usually does not. A healed fracture, a projectile point, a crushed skull, these survive. A season in which neighbouring groups shared access to a water source without bloodshed leaves a much fainter signature. A marriage tie between groups, an exchange of information, a visit, a ritualised settlement of tension, a decision to move away instead of fight. These can be archaeologically almost invisible. This is one reason recent work on peace insists that peaceful intergroup relations are not rare anomalies floating outside human evolution. They are part of the species' toolkit too, even if they are harder to excavate. So when we ask what Nataruk reveals about human nature, part of the honest answer is that it reveals the bias of the record as well as the reality of violence. The archaeological past is often more eloquent about harm than about restraint. That should make us humble when we start drawing moral maps of the species. Even so, humility does not mean evasion. Nataruk does say something clear. It says that human beings in deep prehistory were capable of seeing another human group not as future in-laws, trading partners, or passing strangers, but as targets. That shift in perception is one of the most consequential things about us. Once another group is coded as threat, obstacle, or prize, social intelligence becomes a dangerous asset, planning sharpens, loyalty hardens, violence becomes easier to justify within the attacking group because it is wrapped in the language of necessity, opportunity, revenge, or survival. None of that requires modern ideology. It can happen in very small societies, because what matters is not scale alone, but the ability to draw a line between us and them, then recruit others to act on it. Nataruk, if read as a group attack, is one of the earliest hard reminders that humans learned this move a long time ago. There is also a sobering implication in the setting. Nataruk took place not in a wasteland, but in a productive landscape. The ancient Lake Turkana margin was greener, wetter, and far more attractive than the same area looks now. That means the violence there was not necessarily born of universal desperation. It may have emerged around a place that was good, desirable, and worth controlling. This is a very old human pattern too. We do not only fight when everything is gone, sometimes we fight because something valuable is present and unevenly distributed. A rich shoreline can attract more than fish. It can attract expectations, repeated use, memory, and rivalry. Human nature includes attachment to good places, and attachment can become exclusion when another group wants the same ground. Nataruk therefore hints that our species did not need full-scale property systems before conflict over access could become deadly. A place can matter long before it is fenced. Yet one must be careful not to smuggle fatalism into that observation. Saying humans can fight over valued places is not the same as saying they must. The recent peace literature is useful here because it keeps pointing out that peace is itself an active achievement, not merely the absence of violence. Peace depends on relationships, expectations, norms, trust, and mechanisms that make restraint more rewarding than attack. Those mechanisms can be fragile, but they are real. Human history is not a one-way march from violence to civilization or from innocence to corruption. It is a much messier coexistence of both potentials. The 2024 work on the evolution of peace argues that the conditions required for peace are difficult to achieve and that the same capacity supporting peace can scale conflict. That sounds almost paradoxical, but it matches what Nataruk suggests. The people who attacked, if that is what happened, were almost certainly cooperating among themselves. Peace within one group and violence toward another are not opposites. They are often partners. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about human nature, because it means moral warmth and moral coldness can be adjacent. A group can be full of loyalty and still be lethal. There is something else Nataruk reveals if we resist the urge to read it, only as a referendum on whether humans are bad. It reveals how much of human nature is conditional, not infinitely flexible perhaps, but very sensitive to structure. Ecology matters, group composition matters, recent grievance matters, perceived advantage matters, access to allies matters, expectations about retaliation matter. Even the simple fact of encountering another group in the wrong place at the wrong time can matter. This does not empty human behaviour of responsibility. It simply means that our species is strongly context responsive. The same humans who can maintain broad, peaceful relations under one set of incentives can become organised aggressors under another. The 2023 review of the violence literature makes this point indirectly, when it notes that scholarly conclusions on war in the state of nature keep fluctuating. They fluctuate because there is no single clean baseline. Human beings are not locked into one behavioural mode. They are a strategic social animal with several enduring options. That may be why the old philosophical question can feel so disappointing when answered honestly. What does Nataruk reveal about human nature? That we are capable of terrible things without needing the full apparatus of civilization to teach them to us. That we are also capable of maintaining the kind of intimate cooperation without which none of those victims would have survived long enough to be at that lakeshore together. That our kindness and our cruelty are not housed in separate species. That peace is possible, but not automatic. That violence is possible, but not destiny. That the same intelligence that helps humans coordinate food sharing, migration, childcare, and mutual defense can also help them ambush, overpower, and kill. It is not a flattering answer, but it is a realistic one. Nataruk does not flatter us, and it does not condemn us in one total sentence either. It does something harder. It removes excuses. I think this is also why people keep returning to sites like Nataruk, even when the technical debates become exhausting. We sense that what is at stake is bigger than one archaeological label. We are trying to understand whether violence is a distortion of human life or one of its recurring possibilities. Nataruk suggests the second, not because every group was at war, and not because peace was absent, but because lethal collective aggression was already thinkable and doable at that depth in time. Once that is admitted, the moral question changes. It stops being, are humans naturally peaceful, and becomes, what conditions help peaceful human capacities outrun violent ones? Archaeology cannot answer that alone, but it can strip away comforting legends that get in the way. A species capable of Nataruk is also a species that must build peace on purpose. And perhaps that is the most modern feeling hidden inside this ancient shoreline. The dead at Nataruk do not ask us to choose between cynicism and innocence. They ask us to be more exact. They ask us to accept that violence is old, that cooperation is older than any one violent event, and that the two have likely lived side by side for a very long time. They ask us to look at human nature not as a single verdict, but as a tension between care and exclusion, between solidarity and fear, between the ability to widen the circle and the temptation to close it. The bones do not resolve that tension. They preserve one moment when it broke the wrong way. And once you sit with that for a while, the natural next move is not to rush toward a slogan about man's true nature, but to turn back toward the people themselves, the old lakeshore, and the silence left after the violence, because the final part of this journey belongs less to theory than to the dead. And so we come back to the people themselves, which is really where this story should end, or perhaps where it should have stayed all along. It is easy, after moving through dates and trauma reports and arguments in journals, to let the dead at Nataruk turn into a question rather than a group of people. We start asking whether the site is the earliest evidence of war, whether the injuries prove massacre, whether the bodies were left unburied, whether the skull fractures fit one interpretation or another, and before long the human beings are reduced to a set of positions in an argument. Archaeology has to do some of that. It has to count, compare, challenge, revise, and sometimes disagree very stubbornly. But beneath all of that, the basic shape of the site remains hard to soften. Around 9,500 to 10,500 years ago, at the edge of a lagoon beside a greener and much larger Lake Turkana, the remains of at least 27 people were left in ways that later led excavators to describe severe violence among early Holocene hunter-gatherers. The Cambridge-led team identified men, women and children among them, with several articulated bodies showing trauma and no clear sign of deliberate burial. Even the later critics who challenged the massacre interpretation were not arguing that nothing violent had happened anywhere in this human world. They were arguing over how confidently this site should be read and what exactly it preserves. That difference matters. It means the dead at Nataruk do not disappear when the debate begins. They remain, however we frame them, as evidence that the ancient lakeshore held real human suffering. There is something sobering in the scale of that suffering, because 27 is not an anonymous mass in the way larger numbers sometimes become. 27 is still small enough to imagine. It is a group you could recognise over a few days at a lakeshore camp. It is a number that can contain a pregnant woman, a few very young children, older adults, younger adults, perhaps people who are related and perhaps some who are not, but all close enough in place and time to be caught together in one archaeological scene. The original public summary from Cambridge said the victims may have been members of an extended family, though that remains a suggestion rather than a proven family tree written in bone. The same summary also emphasised the details that made so many readers pause when the discovery was first announced. Bodies found face down, severe cranial fractures, possible sharp force wounds, probable restraints in some cases, fetal bones recovered with the remains of a woman in the last stages of pregnancy. Whether every element of that reconstruction will satisfy every specialist is still open to debate, and it is right that it should be. Still, one does not need to force the largest interpretation to feel the weight of the smaller certainty. These were not isolated pieces of anatomy waiting to be measured. They were separate people, each one occupying a body that had once worked in ordinary ways, carrying water, handling food, watching children, walking along mud and reeds, looking at the same lake from a slightly different angle. Archaeology tends to meet people at the worst moment available to preservation. Nataruk is no exception. I think that is why this site lingers in the mind more stubbornly than many others. A cemetery can be solemn, but it usually shows you what the living did afterward. There is some order to it. Some attempt to gather the dead and set them down with care, however simple or elaborate that care may be. Nataruk appears, at least in the original interpretation, to give us something harsher. It gives us bodies close to where death overtook them, preserved by lagoon conditions rather than by ritual. The water and sediments did the holding. No one came back, or no one came back in a way that left the signs archaeologists normally expect from burial. That absence is one of the quietest and strongest details in the whole story. It hints not only at violent death, but at the collapse of the normal human work that follows death. There were no neat graves to reassure us that however bad the event was, the survivors had time to mourn in an orderly way. Instead, there is an old shoreline that kept what happened mostly to itself until erosion began to surface bone in the modern era. That is one reason later scholars continued to compare Nataruk with Jebel Sahaba, while also stressing how different the two sites are. Jebel Sahaba is older and remains one of the earliest major records of interpersonal violence in the world, but recent reanalysis suggests repeated episodes of violence over time in a funerary setting rather than one single warfare event. Nataruk, if the original excavators are broadly right, feels more like a direct aftermath, less curated by later burial and therefore more immediate. That immediacy is part of what made the site so important and so contested. It also changes how we should think about the old question of whether time makes people kinder. We often like to imagine the deep past as either brutally savage or gently innocent, depending on what story we want from it. Nataruk refuses both of those comforts. It does not show us humanity in a pure state. It shows us humanity in a real state, which is less flattering and more useful. The people there were living as foragers in a rich lakeshore environment during the early Holocene. The original researchers argued that the lagoon-side setting, with easy access to water and fishing and perhaps stored food, may have been a place worth seizing or contesting. That possibility matters because it reminds us that people do not need farms, fences, or kings before a landscape starts to matter enough to fight over. At the same time, those same people had to be cooperating very effectively within their own group before anything violent happened. A small foraging band with children and a pregnant woman is not proof of chaos. It is proof of social skill. It exists because people know how to share labour, protect one another, remember useful places, and make daily life work in a difficult environment. In a strange way then, Nataruk shows both sides of us at once. It shows the capacity to live together and the capacity to turn against another group. The later peace literature makes almost this exact point from a broader theoretical angle, arguing that the same human abilities that make peace possible can also scale conflict. A coordinated group can share food, and a coordinated group can raid. The species did not evolve two separate toolkits for those tasks. We keep using the same one. The disagreement over the site only sharpens that lesson, rather than weakening it. When Stoyanovsky and colleagues challenged the massacre interpretation in Nature, they were doing something important. They were reminding the field that bones do not speak automatically. Fractures have to be diagnosed, body positions have to be read carefully, burial and non-burial have to be distinguished from one another under awkward conditions. Chronology has to be checked against narrative temptation. Their critique asked whether some of the cranial damage might be due to soil compression, and whether the site might reflect more complex burial behaviour, rather than one clean episode of group killing. Mirazon-La and colleagues replied just as firmly that the traumatic lesions were real, that the remains did not represent a cemetery in the ordinary sense, that there was no meaningful association between body position and age, and that intergroup conflict remained the best explanation. That exchange is not a distraction from the human meaning of Nataruk. It is part of it. It shows that the modern effort to treat the ancient dead honestly requires restraint as well as imagination. We owe them neither sensationalism nor timid refusal to see violence when it is present. We owe them the more difficult discipline of trying to say only what the evidence can bear. This may not sound sentimental, but it is one of the more respectful things science can do for the dead. Even with all that caution, certain images are hard to shake. The prone man with the obsidian bladelet embedded in his skull, the young woman reclining on one elbow, the pregnant woman whose knees first protruded from the sediment and whose fetus was later identified within the body. The possibility, still debated, that some hands had been bound. The children, mostly very young, caught in the same general scene. These are the details that keep Nataruk from becoming too abstract, and they also explain why public writing about the site can become a little overconfident. Vivid evidence invites vivid claims, but perhaps what it should invite instead is slower attention. We do not know the names these people used for themselves. We do not know whether they expected trouble that morning or whether it arrived with the speed of weather. We do not know whether the attackers came from another familiar group nearby or from farther away, though the unusual obsidian has been used to suggest the possibility of a different home range. We don't know whether there were survivors watching from a distance later, unable to return, or whether the attack erased the social world present at the shoreline so thoroughly that no one remained to perform the usual obligations toward the dead. What we do know is enough. It is enough to place them in a real landscape, a real early Holocene setting, a real field of human vulnerability. Sometimes the most respectful thing we can do with a prehistoric site is to stop trying to know too much and instead hold steady at the edge of what can be known. There is something oddly intimate about that edge. Archaeology is often presented as though it carries us triumphantly into the past, but most of the time it only brings us within speaking distance. We get near enough to see the outlines and the damage, not near enough to hear the full conversation. At Nataruk, that partial closeness feels especially strong. We know enough to see that this was not merely one injured individual or an accidental death. We know enough to see a group. We know enough to see that the bodies included those who would have made ordinary camp life possible and those who depended on others for protection. We know enough to see that if the original interpretation is correct, the violence reached into the whole structure of a small foraging community, and yet so much remains outside the frame. We cannot identify the exact motive. Was it a raid for access to resources at a good lagoon margin? Was it retaliation for an earlier injury elsewhere? Was it an encounter that turned deadly with shocking speed? The Cambridge team proposed seizure of territory, women, children, or stored food as one possibility. But even they offered it as an informed hypothesis, not a solved police report. Perhaps that is as it should be. Ancient violence should remain difficult to explain. The moment we can account for it too smoothly, we begin turning the dead into props for our preferred theory of human behaviour. And maybe that is the quietest return we can make to the ancient dead at Nataruk. Not by pretending to settle every argument, but by refusing to lose the human scale inside them. A site like this can easily become a slogan. Earliest war, oldest massacre, proof of human brutality, evidence that nothing has changed, evidence that everything has changed. But none of those phrases lies down in the sediment beside a lagoon. A man with an obsidian wound does, a woman with fractured knees does, small children do, a pregnant woman does. Those are the realities first. The theories come after. So when we leave Nataruk, I think we should leave it in that order. First the people, then the argument. First the lives interrupted, then the labels. First the shoreline, then the philosophy. 10,000 years later, the place is quiet enough that a person could stand there and think only of wind and dry ground if they did not know what had surfaced from it. But the knowledge changes the silence. It becomes a little heavier, a little more occupied, and perhaps that is right. Some sites should not become loud monuments in the mind. Some should remain quiet, not because nothing happened there, but because too much did. Nataruk is one of those places. It asks for a slower kind of memory, the kind that does not rush to make itself wise from someone else's last moment. It simply stands still long enough to recognise that the ancient dead were once ordinary people at the edge of the water, and that being ordinary never made them safe. So if we return one last time in thought to that greener margin of Lake Turkana, it is probably best not to return with banners, declarations, or too much certainty. Better to return as archaeology itself often has to return, quietly and with care. The lagoon is there. The reeds are there in imagination, if not now in reality. The shore is busy in the way useful shores usually are. Then something terrible happens. Long after that, the water withdraws, the climate shifts, the landscape dries, the sediments hold what they can, and eventually a field assistant notices bone on the surface. A team arrives. Goats are crossing the area, gullies are eating into the site, the dead are surfacing whether anyone is ready for them or not. From there, all the argument follows. But before the dispute and after it, the ancient dead remain where the story began. They remain as a reminder that deep history is not only made of inventions, migrations and clever adaptations. It is also made of fear, injury, interruption and loss. If there is any comfort in that knowledge, it is not the false comfort of thinking violence is natural and therefore excusable, or unnatural and therefore safely gone. It is the quieter comfort of accuracy. The past was human. That is what Nataruk finally gives us. Not a myth of beginnings, but a human scene, difficult and incomplete, in which cooperation, vulnerability and violence already lived side by side. And with that, the best thing to do is probably what the site itself encourages. Lower the voice a little, leave room for uncertainty, and let the old shoreline keep some of its silence.